WMIA accounting effort. Testifying were DIA critics and its supporters. In previous meetings, members have heard from former U.S. government officials who served during the Vietnam era. They've also probed the role of Central Intelligence and investigated a possible Russian connection to the POW-MIA issue. Committee Chairman Senator John Kerry of Massachusetts and his colleagues will also focus this week on the progress being made with families of the missing U.S. servicemen. Members are also expected to discuss the success in conducting operations in Southeast Asia during the past year and examine private efforts to resolve the POW-MIA issue. Funding and authority for the committee expires at the end of this month. After the conclusion of this final round of hearings, the committee will issue a report with conclusions and recommendations for the next Congress and the new Clinton administration. And with that brief background, we now return to the Hart Senate Office Building for the remainder of Tuesday's proceedings.
Take their seats. This panel is to discuss the workings and relationships on this issue of the interagency group. While some members of this panel are also of interest to the committee for other areas of inquiry, we're going to try to stay on the interagency group aspect of it and not get into a lot of the DIA portion of it, although, Mr. Sheets, there are further issues we want to discuss with respect to live sightings and so forth, but I think we'll reserve those. We are on Friday, is that not correct?
Yes, sir.
So on Friday. Am I correct that everyone here has previously testified to the committee and is already sworn in? Well, I just remind everybody then that they continue under oath before the committee. It's my understanding, Mr. Secretary, that you are going to open up and lead off, and then Mr. Sheets, Mr. Ford, Mr. Childress. And is Ms. Griffith, Ann Mills Griffith here?
She was
early. She'll be
here.
back. Okay, why don't you start?
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be back on Friday, according to the schedule, and I have testimony which I'd like to submit for the record. But if it's okay with you, what I might do is deliver part of it now, and then I wouldn't expect that when I came back on Friday that I would have any other prepared testimony. So if I could,
that would be helpful, and I think on Friday we'll probably cover larger ground on some areas, so appreciate it.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Smith, my testimony today, I'd like to provide the committee with an overview of the diplomatic activities and other efforts of the U.S. government on the POW-MIA issue over the past 2.5 years, since Secretary Baker's July 1990 initiative reinvigorated our discussions with Vietnam. The government has, of course, been pursuing answers to the POW-MIA questions since the end of the war, but the last 30 months have seen both the renewed effort and the most significant results. Much of what we've accomplished is due to the leadership of General Vesey, President's Special Emissary to Hanoi, as well as the work of hundreds of Defense Department employees and, of course, the efforts of many members of Congress like yourselves. But I believe the many diplomatic initiatives we have undertaken during the last 2.5 years, along with the policy framework which we have put in place, have been crucial to the progress we have achieved and have established the basis for continued progress in the future. Since April 1991, the central element of this framework has been our roadmap policy, which calls for a series of commensurate steps by both sides as we move toward achieving our objectives: the fullest possible accounting for our missing men, Vietnam's continued support for the UN peace plan in Cambodia, and the release of re-education camp detainees in Vietnam. The roadmap is premised on the theory, based on 16 years of tough experience, that the only way to move forward is if both parties are taking steps to meet the concerns of the other. As we explained to the Vietnamese when we presented them with the roadmap, by laying out a schedule of concrete steps, we intended to give both sides the confidence to move forward. And while we indicated that we were prepared to take significant actions in a relatively brief period of time, we made absolutely clear that the speed at which we make progress on the roadmap depends on Vietnam's actions to take account for our POW MIAs and its continued support for the UN peace plan in Cambodia. Looking back over these 30 months, I believe we can point to a number of significant accomplishments of this policy approach with Vietnam. 2.5 years ago, we did not even have a regular channel of diplomatic communications with Vietnam. Then, in July 1990, former Secretary Baker established a channel for dialogue with senior Vietnamese officials. And we have since aggressively used this channel for addressing our POW MIA and Cambodia concerns, including meetings at the Secretary, Undersecretary, Assistant Secretary, and Deputy Assistant Secretary level, as well as meetings by the Secretary of Defense, Undersecretary of Defense, and Assistant Secretary and Deputy Assistant Secretary level as well. And I would note in particular the October 8th meeting, which Acting Secretary Eagleberger, Secretary Cheney, and Assistant Secretary Clark held with Foreign Minister Kam, and Undersecretary Cantor's meeting with Vice Foreign Minister Ka last summer as being of particular importance. 2.5 years ago, we did not have a presence in Vietnam. We now have a POW MIA office in Hanoi, staffed by 11 full-time Americans and numerous TDY personnel dedicated to resolving this issue. And we've also established POW MIA offices in Phnom Penh and Vientiane during the same time frame. 2.5 years ago, we had virtually no success in obtaining from Vietnam records and other documentary materials related to our missing men. Thanks to an initiative by General Vesey, we began to make progress in this area in late 1990 with the first visit of an information research team, which, if memory serves me right, Carl Ford headed. In February 1992, General Vesey received a copy of a document we had long sought, an 84-page record of shoot-downs of our aircraft, which offered important information on the fates of a number of POW MIAs. And the Vietnamese agreed to provide us further access to their records during Assistant Secretary Solomon's March visit to Hanoi, and most recently during General Vesey's mission, he obtained a commitment from the leadership of Vietnam to provide us with all POW MIA-related materials. 2.5 years ago, we did not have a mechanism in place for investigating reported sightings of live Americans in Vietnam. We now have an established process and have satisfactorily dealt with almost 50 live sighting investigations, 15 of them on short notice. And I know, Mr. Chairman, that you and some of your colleagues participated in some of these live sighting investigations last month. And the work of your committee has reinforced this process and led, in my judgment, to its present effectiveness. There's one specific aspect of these live sighting investigations to which I wish to give special emphasis: access to prisons. When I visited Hanoi in July 1991, no American official had ever had access to a prison in Vietnam or elsewhere to search for possible live POW MIAs. During my meeting with Vice Foreign Minister Lê Mai, I pressed for, and he agreed to, U.S. investigators having access to prisons in central Vietnam so that we could follow up on the then widely publicized photo of 3 men identified by their families as missing pilots. The first 2 prison visits followed a few days later. Since then, and in good part due to the work of the members of this committee, American officials have been in and out of a number of other prisons in Vietnam, including the notorious Hanoi Hilton, Tan Liet, Bac Bac, Shun Tay, 17 Ly Nam Day, the Hai Phom Prison, the B5 Provincial Prison, and the Vinh Quang Prison Camp. And these are in addition to the prisons and confinement areas, including the Citadel, visited by you, Mr. Chairman, and other committee members during your most recent trip. 2.5 years ago, we were making little progress in our field investigations of discrepancy cases and other related cases. And in fact, from the start of the field investigations in September 1988, the initiative of General Vesey, through the spring of 1991, a 31-month period, we conducted 13 joint field operations, but were only able to investigate 144 cases. Then in April '91, we presented Vietnam with the roadmap. The 14th field operation was the first conducted after the roadmap was in place. And the DoD investigators reported that in that one operation, they obtained more information on our missing men than in all previous 13 operations combined. And in the 20 months since the roadmap was presented, we have investigated 286 cases. That's double the number of cases investigated in the 31 months before the roadmap. And during the course of these field investigations, U.S. experts have been able to interview hundreds and hundreds of Vietnamese citizens, including many who have provided firsthand accounts about the fate of U.S. servicemen. It's probably a failure of our process that we don't have a better yardstick to measure this important progress, which has been painstakingly obtained by teams operating under the Joint Task Force full accounting head, General Tom Needham. But it's essential that the American people understand just how much has been accomplished through the thousands of hours put in by the dedicated men and women of the Defense Department working on this issue. Let me give you just a few examples from the several hundred reports we have obtained in the last 12 months. In one case, 5 separate witnesses provided firsthand reports of an American POW killed during an escape attempt from a POW camp. In another report, 3 witnesses described the shoot-down of a U.S. helicopter and the death of 7 Americans as a result of the crash. Another witness told U.S. investigators how he participated in an attack and the killing of a U.S. soldier who was walking alone down a path near a stream. Other Vietnamese veterans described how an American prisoner sustained a minor leg injury during an aircraft crash, but later contracted malaria and died while being transported by stretcher to a dispensary in a mountainous part of Vietnam. A former staff member of the Cos Vinh prison camp system described how an American prisoner was executed in retaliation for the supposed killing of a Viet Cong cadre by U.S. forces. And finally, in another case, U.S. personnel visited an extremely remote part of northern Vietnam where they were provided 8 sets of remains by local officials. The team then set out to visit the crash site from which the remains reportedly came. It was a 6-hour hike with ascent to the site made only by hand-over-hand climbing on jagged limestone outcrops and areas of loose rubble. The U.S. team was led to the spot where the remains were said to have been buried. Digging, they found a bone and tooth fragments, along with some aircraft wreckage and life support equipment. It was a significant accomplishment, made with great effort and some considerable risk to the individuals involved. And in commenting on the operation, the U.S. team leader wrote, quote, "The spirit of cooperation and friendship between the U.S. and Vietnamese was on a high level. No obstacles were encountered that could not be overcome by the joint team's efforts," end quote. Now, I could go on and read other summaries, but this is to give you a sense of what's in these reports. And I would not pretend to suggest that all cooperation in Vietnam is at this same level. It's not. Obviously, these are tragic stories. However, it's important for us to be able, at long last, to provide this information to the families of the soldiers. And as a result of all this painstaking work, the Defense Department has been able to officially confirm the fate of 64 of our discrepancy cases. And in addition, in the last 8 months, we have received detailed, mostly first-hand accounts about the likely fate of another 150 men listed as POW MIA. And so these investigations are providing the important answers we seek. And Mr. Chairman, the vastly improved level of cooperation is a clear indication that our policy of both sides taking a series of commensurate steps is working. And while we choose to not formally close many such cases, including discrepancy cases, because we may still hope to recover remains or find some additional documentary evidence, we have answers. Not always perfect answers, but answers nonetheless about what likely happened to the men involved. The recovery, repatriation, and identification of remains of our missing is an important goal of the administration's policy. Since General Vesey undertook his first mission to Hanoi, the U.S. has repatriated over 300 sets of remains from Vietnam, which has resulted in approximately 120 Americans being accounted for. Another 77 remains can't be identified, but cannot be excluded from being Americans. In addition, the Army's Identification Laboratory, SILHI, also has more than 600 portions of remains which may never be identified. Here, too, we've achieved important results in the last 2.5 years. Since September 1990, the United States has accepted 79 sets of remains from Vietnam. Additional remains are now available to us, and the Defense Department is sending experts to Vietnam later this month to evaluate those remains. Of course, we will strive to recover many more remains, but it's important to note that repatriation of remains is now taking place on a regular basis. I also want to note the significant progress we've made on POW MIA issues with countries other than Vietnam. In Cambodia, there's been a dramatic increase in POW MIA cooperation since July 1991. At that time, there was no meaningful POW MIA cooperation between the U.S. and Phnom Penh authorities. In Beijing, I met with senior State of Cambodia officials, and we agreed for the first time that a U.S. team would travel to Cambodia to investigate the photo of 3 men identified by their families as missing American pilots. And since then, we've opened a POW MIA office in Phnom Penh, and the State of Cambodia has permitted the use of U.S. military helicopters in field operations, which improves the safety conditions for our personnel. During the last 2.5 years, Lao cooperation has also improved markedly. We now have a POW MIA office in Vientiane. And in 1991, joint teams conducted 6 exercises, during which 15 surveys, 5 recovery operations, and 5 investigations were conducted. In 1992, U.S. and Lao field teams conducted 7 joint activities, during which we excavated 7 crash or grave sites and investigated or surveyed 30 cases. And of the 7 sites, remains were found in 2 locations. I might also mention that Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Al Patak and I serve on the U.S.-Russia Joint Commission on POW MIA, and I know one of the subjects you've talked about today is the Citadel. And I just want to be sure that the record notes that during our last trip, we discussed that extensively with Russian officials and were provided important information about what might or might not exist, because there had been Russian firms and construction advisors involved in certain construction in Hanoi. And just so you know, that was taken very seriously by me, and I personally pursued that, and I think we got some useful information about that during that trip. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, as I believe my testimony indicates, we've made very significant progress on POW MIA over the past 30 months. We now have POW MIA offices in Hanoi, Phnom Penh, and Vientiane, and we have conducted 29 joint field investigations in the 3 countries. Through these searches, we have officially confirmed the fates of 64 of the men listed as discrepancy cases, and we have received detailed information on the fates of 150 other men. We have a live sighting investigation mechanism in place in Vietnam, and we have already investigated 48 reported sightings of Americans, including through access to more than 10 prisons. We've made steady progress in repatriating remains, with 79 sets returned from Vietnam and more undergoing initial evaluation later this month. The most important progress may have come in just the last few months, with Vietnam's initial implementation of its unprecedented commitment to provide us access to all POW MIA materials in their archives and museums. Cooperation in Cambodia has been excellent, and it's been steadily improving in Laos. For Vietnam, the roadmap policy has effectively encouraged that country to expand and accelerate its cooperation on both POW MIA and Cambodia. This policy has established a framework for steps by both sides, which has, I believe, the best possibility to provide us with the fullest possible accounting for our missing men. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, we do not yet have all the answers we must have. But I think the progress we have made over the last 2 years shows that our policy is working and it produces results. And as we address the question of what to do next, to take more steps or to hold back, we should be guided by this litmus test. What will help maintain this unprecedented level of cooperation and progress, and indeed increase it? I can speak for the State Department in assuring this committee and the American people that we have consistently been guided by this test in determining what steps we should take toward Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And as someone who spent 6 years in Vietnam during the war and who still feels the special bond of those who were in combat together, I want to add that as long as I hold my current position, we will continue to do everything possible to ensure that the families of our missing men can know the fate of their loved ones. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Sheets.
Mr. Chairman, Senators, I'm pleased to once again appear before the committee, this time to participate in a panel examining the operation of the POW MIA Interagency Group, commonly referred to as the IAG. I would like to begin by pointing out that DIA serves the IAG in an intelligence advisory capacity only. DIA does not play a role in setting policy, nor does the agency representative have a vote when issues are put to the various members for their approval. I would note, however, that the IAG deliberations I have observed are generally quite thorough, with vigorous discussion and advocacy being the order of the day. And while DIA has no vote at the IAG, I can recall no instance where DIA was not permitted to press its view of the issue at hand. DIA is generally afforded an opportunity by the Chair, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, Mr. Ken Quinn, sitting to my right, to start each IAG meeting by presenting an oral summary of selected recent intelligence cables, particularly those dealing with receipt and investigation of live sighting reports and discrepancy cases. I generally handle this responsibility myself, speaking extemporaneously for 5 to 10 minutes. Since the committee has examined in detail all live sighting reports held by DIA, and all the reports either have been or are being declassified for release through the Library of Congress, I have not come here today prepared to discuss specific reports or cases. The questions appended to my letter of invitation to appear with this panel deal with how policy is set by the IAG and the impact of such policy decisions upon the Department of Defense. I have already explained that DIA has no role in policy setting by the IAG. Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, Mr. Carl Ford, sitting here to my left, also participates on this panel and has attended many an IAG meeting representing DoD policy interests. I defer to him to answer such questions. Nonetheless, as a participant on this panel, I would be pleased to address, to the best of my ability, any questions the committee has concerning DIA interaction with the IAG.
Secretary.
Mr. Chairman, I have a written statement that with your permission, I'd like to submit for the record. I would also, with your permission, not read even portions of it. I might make a comment or two and then allow the others to make their presentations. I think the thing that I would highlight from my written statement is my judgment that when I arrived at the Pentagon in March, April of 1989, if there hadn't been an IAG, I would have been forcefully advocating that one be formed. I don't think that this issue or any other important issue can be effectively managed and policy can't be effectively implemented without groups of this sort. As you, I'm sure, aware, it's common practice and routine to have policy coordination committees, is what they've been called for a number of years, on all major issues. And interagency, we get together and talk about important issues. The only unique thing about the IAG is that it has been ongoing as an issue for year after year after year. Most of the PCCs have a much shorter life than that and go from issue to issue. There are some that I sit on that are meeting regularly like the IAG, and have gone on for a number of years. But I think the IAG probably holds the record for being a policy coordination group that has met regularly over such a long period of time. Again, I think that it's unthinkable to me that we could operate without an IAG. Thank you.
I would ask that this statement be put in the record, and I'll summarize it. I've given copies. I'd like to put the IAG in some perspective, sort of along the lines that Secretary Ford was talking. Every important issue of priority in any administration has an interagency body that, in fact, receives briefings, develops or implements policy, or reviews progress, or to complain to each other about how one participant or another is wonderful or defective in the overall task. Now, I served on many interagency groups, regional as well as functional, while assigned at the NSC. There's a difference, though, between regional or country-specific interagency groups and functional interagency groups. Regional or country-specific interagency groups are organized along regional lines and established organizational lines, whereas functional groups cut across a number of agencies and tasks. And examples other than POWMI: refugee affairs, narcotics, arms control. And in POWMI, it was the most complex one that I sat on, because coordination went from Asia to Washington, refugee camps, Army, casualty officers, the normal DOD, NSC, and state functions. And it crossed, of course, into the Congress and the committees and the individual ones. And then it had its emotional overlay, checkered history, and numerous individuals of all stripes in the public or elsewhere charging conspiracy, and rescuers, and people that want to be diplomats or intelligence agents. And all of this affected and threw into this big soup mix that we were dealing with. The effectiveness of the IAG rests largely, I believe, on the following. Number one, the commitment of the members to the issue. Number two, the objectivity of the chairman. And number three, the absence of hidden agendas. And number four, the participants' understanding of the overall issue. I was a member from January '82 to March of '89. During this period, there were three chairmen, Ambassadors Donahue, Monjo, and Mr. Lambertson. Each had extensive Asian experience and was dedicated to the issue and worked diligently to resolve it. I'm sorry none of them were here. They were the chairman. I was a member, but from my perspective. Now, the wording of the questions suggests, at least to me, that someone thinks the interagency group has directive authority. It is essentially a policy development coordination body. In my experience throughout this, inevitably problems that were resolved were done with the equities of POW-MIA in mind, and I know of no important issue that came before it where there was potential conflict, whether it was Cambodia or nervousness or whatever it was, where the POW interagency group, a significant policy issue where it appeared to conflict, where something could not be worked out to proceed. We received briefings from everyone involved during my period there. Important briefings were recommended and given to the higher leadership, to include the president. DOD representatives in turn heard what state was doing on their efforts and NSC views on priorities. And clearly the League representative, Ann Griffiths, to my left, always brought a full agenda that needed attention, and she could access and did access people in all agencies from top to bottom, and brought great insights to us about what was happening or what was not happening. The IAG in one way or another affected every member during my tenure, and I believe for the future of the resolution of the issue, it is absolutely critical that it be maintained. It's the only vehicle that can integrate POWMI into foreign policy, prevent stovepipe single action agency uncoordinated actions that could adversely affect this issue. It keeps the entire bureaucracy focused as a national priority. It remains and keeps it sensitive to family, congressional, and public concerns, and ensures an oversight vehicle through interagency vetting of policy proposals. I can visualize a future without an IAG when the following criteria are met. Number one, the Vietnamese have resolved all last known alive or other easily resolvable cases through the return of a live American, their remains, or a national decision has been made using the DIA database on Vietnamese knowledgeability and the implementation of Vietnamese agreements which demonstrate that Vietnam has institutionalized real cooperation with us on this issue for the long term. Under such circumstances, the U.S. could confidently, I believe, decentralize the effort, which would essentially be cleaning up the battlefield to operational agencies such as JTF for long-term efforts. Philosophically, I would say bureaucratic behavior in isolation is not inherently evil, but it's certainly inherently self-delusional. And groupthink, if combined to one agency or department without exposure to other views, inevitably leads to institutional bias, unbalanced policy, and the least painful solution. Without an IAG, given the current situation, POWMI policy would inevitably end up where it was in the late 70s, and no one needs another cancer like that. The comments on the IAG relate directly also to your questions concerning the role of the League of Families. An interagency group without the League represented would lead to a higher level of destructive groupthink. The League representative in the IAG, Ann Griffiths, due to her 20-plus years of experience and continuity, now through 5 administrations, was the only other participant in the IAG who could reach out easily to all levels. This access caused occasional heartburn, sometimes well-deserved, sometimes self-inflicted. But without the National League of Families, POWMI would not be a national priority today. The League began 22 years ago, helped bring home those at homecoming, and stayed the course. Since that time, they have not only built bridges to the Indo-Chinese governments, but have done so while keeping faith with the families. Their demands have been based upon facts and reason. When shown to have been wrong or misled, they acknowledged it easier than some government officials who would not. They, the League, have the most to gain or lose, and they have taken more heat than anyone in this room for their principles and objectivity. An interagency group without the League would over time wither and die. Further, family privacy would be violated more than it is now due to a lack of day-to-day sensitivity. On the other hand, if the priority is not maintained in the interagency process or by national policy, the League would probably be the first to resign, and the questions about its role would be academic. Under such circumstances, hopefully we wouldn't need another committee. Thank you.
Well, I too welcome the opportunity to be here again. I have a full testimony that I will insert in the record, which includes the IAG adopted founding policies adopted in 1981. But before addressing the committee's specific questions, I feel compelled to comment briefly on recent developments which have caused the family serious concern. The widely publicized visit just concluded by Mr. Chairman, Senators Brown and Daschle, has prompted extensive and negative reaction from family members and veterans throughout the country. The primary reason is concern that steps being recommended by the committee chairman might be taken by the Bush administration before POWMI criteria in the roadmap have been met by Vietnam. Although the roadmap calls for U.S. reciprocity, significant steps have been taken in advance to demonstrate good faith on the part of the United States and to encourage further actions by the Vietnamese. In fact, Vietnam has not taken 2 key POWMI actions called for in the earliest phases of the roadmap. Despite heavy publicity surrounding joint field activities, release of combat photography, access to selected wartime trophies, and some improvement in provision of archival data to U.S. specialists, the accounting has slowed to a virtual crawl over the past 2 years. One could mistakenly assume that the lack of results in terms of accounting means that little accounting is available. The basic facts and even recent photos refute such an assumption, and we view as premature recommendations for additional U.S. steps to reward the appearance of full and open cooperation. Having said that, the League is on record in support of existing policy. If Vietnam elected to rapidly fulfill the roadmap's POWMI criteria, I am confident that the President would reciprocate as he has pledged to do. I respectfully suggest that now is the time for steadfast resolve. Vietnamese leaders must understand that taking unilateral actions now to account for Americans last known alive and easily resolved cases, other easily resolved cases, is in their interest. The President, Acting Secretary of State Eagleburger, and Secretary of Defense Cheney have recently reiterated this message. It would be very helpful for the committee and U.S. companies interested in doing business in Vietnam to send that same signal as well. You have asked me to respond to specific questions regarding the POWMI interagency group and its impact on Department of Defense and other U.S. government agencies' efforts to resolve the issue. Formed in 1980, the IAG adopted a series of structural and policy proposals. As I mentioned, a copy is attached to my full testimony. After the war, this issue was virtually ignored by successive administrations, and efforts to account for POWMIAs were left to the uniformed military without serious executive branch policy, focus, involvement, or priority. Once formed and functional, the IAG's role has been to develop policy and to ensure operational implementation to achieve POWMI objectives. Fundamental to the IAG's effectiveness within the bureaucracy was its mutual confidence, shared commitment, and full coordination among all key participants. As the only non-government member throughout the existence of the IAG, I have been in a very unique and sometimes unenviable position, but one which the families have consistently supported as being in the best interest of resolving the issue. Once priority was institutionalized in the Reagan-Bush administration, initiatives were considered, discussed, adopted, and tasked to the responsible implementing department or agency, usually in the Department of Defense. In the earlier stages, it was often necessary to overcome bureaucratic obstacles. However, implementation became more effective as understanding increased on the significance of the raised priority. A benefit throughout the Reagan-Bush administration was the continuity of policy and policymakers. Despite rotations at the action officer level, senior officials gained extensive knowledge and mutual confidence which spread across the entire administration. This was a major factor during the buildup from virtual zero priority in 1980 to the high priority which is now in place. From a practical standpoint, IAG participants coordinated on and monitored a wide variety of POWMI actions, such as collection and analysis of intelligence, diplomatic initiatives, communication with family members, congressional endeavors, and public awareness activities. Based on IAG recommendations and decisions, policies were developed which impacted directly on U.S. efforts to achieve POWMI objectives, and procedures were improved in an effort to rebuild family member confidence which had been shattered from years of official neglect and apathy. In this respect, the Defense Department played an instrumental role, as did the service casualty offices. One of the IAG's greatest challenges was rebuilding intelligence collection and analysis after years of disintegration from near total lack of political support. The NSC Director of Asian Affairs, Mr. Childress to my right, was instrumental in raising the priority and increasing personnel and assets in support of the President's policy that resolving this issue was, in fact, a matter of highest national priority. This was followed up by DOD and DIA with additional priority and resources. The current extensive operations are a direct result of IAG efforts in the early to mid-1980s. Throughout this process, there have been disagreements and sometimes very heated exchanges. However, in most cases, consensus could be reached. When the IAG could not reach agreement, recommendations were made for consideration at a higher level. As to the future role of the IAG, until substantial results have been obtained, POWMI must remain an integral part of the policy mainstream. This is necessary to ensure that agreements reached are fully implemented and criteria established to gain results are met. Until POWMI objectives now encompassed in the roadmap are achieved, I believe it is crucial that the IAG continue its important role. In the past, isolating POWMIA from broader policy matters has meant and could again mean a low level of priority and policy attention to obtaining answers. Once Americans last known alive are accounted for, alive or dead, and families receive final answers on the other easily resolved cases, the IAG function would no longer be as important to the process. At that point, a longer-term operational approach would likely be adequate to achieve the fullest possible accounting. Of course, that hypothetical situation could subsequently change if cooperation and results halted. Direct policy and involvement would again be required. Concerning the League's future role, our charter and bylaws provide specific guidance. Once the League's threefold objective is met, there is no reason for continuation. We have often stated that the League is in business to go out of business as quickly as possible. The timing is up to the U.S. government and those in Indochina, primarily Vietnam, which holds the keys to accounting for the vast majority of our missing relatives. From our standpoint, the sooner the better. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Quinn, how often is the Interagency Committee meeting now?
It has, we've had different schedules of meeting when it's, since its existence, or since I came into the process in 1990. We used to meet on kind of an ad hoc basis for about the first year, and then after that, at Carl Ford's initiative, we went to a once-a-week schedule, and that's the schedule now. Although I think we've probably gone now for maybe 4 or 5 weeks, and we haven't had a meeting following the trip that Mrs. Griffiths and I went on to Hanoi.
Well, is there any requirement as to how often you meet?
No, it's just the agreement among all the principals. There's no requirement.
Is there any membership beyond those people represented here?
Yes, the NSC has a seat at the table, and the JCS, General Mike Ryan is the usual participant, would be there.
Now, at this point, the committee sought to secure some sort of sense of what is deliberated and what the essence of the interagency group's meetings are, and basically we got very little from you. Why is the department unable to give more than a few pages of records relating to your agenda or deliberations?
All of the records of the IAG that exist in the State Department have gone through me, and I've said to send them up, and
right, but basically it amounts to a few pages. Do you not keep records of your meetings, or is there no meeting requirement, documentation requirement?
The work product, what you have are sort of our State Department memos that are produced. Usually it amounts to a page or two after the meeting, just to sort of summarize what was said or what was decided. And the other work product would
we only
be
got records since 1991. You've been
That's
meeting
right.
for 10 years prior. We got no records of that.
There was no record from 1990 to that period in 1991.
So there's 9 years without records?
Well,
8
before
years,
that,
no records?
I don't know. Maybe Dick Childress, Mrs. Griffiths would know.
When I came in 82, January of 82, there were notes being taken by the Defense Department, and then they were circulated around in draft to make sure everyone agreed this is what transpired and who had the task. Sometime in 83, 84, after we got rolling, it became sort of a waste of time. We all knew where we were going. We're talking to each other over the phone frequently. The meetings, the IG meetings, were more informal. Your job's this, yes, my job's that, and they, people would then implement through their own directives within their department. So,
who would set the agenda?
In those days, it was everyone. We would say, all right, we're having an IAG meeting, and I think the coordinator then was Colonel Venanzi. He would call around to everyone saying, we're having an IAG, what do you want on the agenda? And then each agency would add their things in, and that would get published.
It would be fair to say that effectively the IAG was sort of the principal mover and shaker with respect to this issue over those period of years?
Yes, I would say so, yeah. Either that or the individual members in their departments. I mean, they were the most sensitive to the issue, and when they would leave the IAG or they're in their department, it's state or defense, everyone in that department would look to them because they're the IAG member. So they would execute unilaterally in their department, And then the coordination and broad policy development and initiatives, a lot of those emanated from the IAG.
And Senator Kerry, I would add one comment to give you a better appreciation for it. The IAG meetings were about once a week, but I would dare say that we were on the phone not only daily, but often several times a day with our colleagues on the IAG. This was a moving situation, and that before, if we came back from an IAG and tried to write up what had happened, it would have already changed before it could have made any impact. And that where you find the paper is when the IAG would get to a point where it was important that our superiors knew the status of what was going on, had to make a decision, and at that point a decision memorandum from Defense, and I'm sure State, and the NSC would go forward to the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, the President on these issues. And that's where the records of the IAG are really found. But I would argue again that that's the same way we do Iraq, Iran, Japan, China, any sort of issue that we have going in the executive branch, that once you get to the deputies level and once you get to the NSC level, you will find our papers being submitted for our superiors to know what we're thinking, get their thoughts back to us and prepare talking points, that sort of thing. But this is a working group. This is not a formal set down, everybody introduces each other. We've been working, fighting, traveling together now for a number of years. We know how each other think. We don't need to write anything down. And what we write down often is what we need to do for the next meeting. And it's usually a sort of an informal, off the back of an envelope approach.
Mr. Chairman, if I could interject, having
Before you
been...
do, let me just come back here for a second. I mean, don't you... I mean, when you're dealing with an issue that's as volatile as this, and you've got as many people crying conspiracy as you have, and then you've got this sort of entity running around making decisions, which has a special interest group, non-governmental entity represented on it, which has been the subject of criticism in each of the reports of the people who were subject to the prior panels, don't you feel that you're just contributing to the problems of this issue by not having a record with openness?
I didn't see it as sort of a sunset or openness issue. We were constantly during that...
I'm asking the question on behalf of a lot of people who have asserted that.
Well, the fact is that we were reporting our activities, and there is paper available in each agency that's been turned over, because my records, my boss's records, other records...
Well, how do you make a decision? When you make a decision that is going to affect policy, do you vote on it? Do you vote on the policy?
My experience has been that there are a number of issues, usually more routine issues, that a consensus very quickly develops. And that it really doesn't require anything other than a notice to our superiors that this issue has come up and it's been worked out, and it's often done orally. Most of the issues with the IAG didn't come that simply. The major policy issues were often in dispute, and that there is ample record of what various players and agencies thought about each of those issues.
And
now that we didn't...
That record would be where?
Now, it didn't always say this is the IAG, but all of these issues, that the records that we've been turning over contain much of what happened at the IAG meetings, at least from our defense records. When it was important enough to let the Secretary of Defense and the Undersecretary of Defense know happened at an IAG meeting, they got a piece of paper. And that piece of paper explains the various positions of people in quite frank detail. And I know the same practices as at State. I do not, for any of my other policy coordination committees, have a note taker, keep a record, or do it any other way. I do POW MIA the same way I did Iraq during the war, the same way I did Korea when I worked Korea. I don't do it special. I do it just as I do all other important issues. And it's not the common practice in my organization to take notes at PCCs or IAG meetings. When a deputy's meeting, the next higher level has occurred, there is a requirement to write a note to the secretary about what happened at that meeting. And in those cases, we do keep a record of what occurred from our perspective at each of these meetings. And while we might miss some, I'd say that 80–90% of the meetings are that way, but not at the level that the IAG operates. But Ken might have the state may have a different policy than we do at Defense.
All of the important policy judgments or decisions that would result following an IAG meeting, not necessarily taken at the IAG meeting, would be written down as either agreed talking points, which would be delivered by somebody to the Vietnamese or whoever we're going to see, or as a telegram, which would go out. So those judgments, those policy decisions, in which all the agencies would have to agree, would always be written down, and there would never be anything of that nature that would not be written down.
Why would we not have received those in conjunction with the requests that we made?
You have, sir, as far as I know. For example,
only since 1991. That's all we got.
Well, because you asked for IAG. I mean, we have given you, I know because
So what you're saying is there's no formal IAG record. There are records contained pertaining to IAG in each of the individual departments.
Yes, sir. For example,
what happens, for instance, in the League, which is not a department?
The League doesn't take IAG minutes either. When we had IAG minutes, it was what Mr. Childers referred to, and it was really before the IAG got more serious and started dealing as the process was being institutionalized. There are some old DOD minutes, I think in 82, 83, back when Dan O'Donohue was chairman, maybe even before that, when there was a rotating chairmanship right after it was formed. But it was a collective consensus type of thing, and for a very brief time.
But you have to discuss things to get to consensus. I mean,
well, they're always discussed, but
when you arrive at a consensus, there has to be some memorialization of what the consensus is.
No, the memorialization or the out product of the IAG would come out by virtue of talking points to use in meetings, would come out as tasking from DOD to JTF or
well, I want to ask
whatever.
some questions after about the tasking, but I want to let my colleagues get a little chance here.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just add one brief comment. I think that every cable that has been sent out from state or defense that had to do with a set of talking points for Vietnam or instructions to our ambassadors in the field were at one point hammered out in an IAG meeting, and that we would be talking on the telephone about these as well, so that the output of the IAG was usually a product that's a part of the official record that you have access to, but it doesn't say that's where it happened. But often we would sit down on the IAG and actually hammer out the wording of a cable, and that would be the result of the meeting.
I understand. Senator Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a general question for any of you who would like to answer it. In looking back, the POW MIA fact book from the Defense Department, if you read that, originally certain congressional staffers were from both the House Armed Services, House Foreign Affairs Committee and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, were originally intended to be participants in that process. That was never institutionalized. In fact, at one point I remember requesting the opportunity, I think it was in 1990, to attend a meeting of the IAG and was denied. You can see why you deny me, but I'm a little concerned about no, candidly, is that, do you think it would have helped? I understand the separation of powers issue, and I realize that is a legitimate issue here, but do you think it might have helped in terms of what you're doing to have had appropriate clearance, people with appropriate clearances from the Congress, whether they be Senate Foreign Relations or House Foreign Affairs, to sit in, to participate in those meetings? Just a quick judgment on that.
I would just note that that is exactly the arrangement we have now with the U.S.-Russia Commission on POW/MIA.
It works pretty well.
I think it works very well. I think we have in Moscow, we had staffers from the committee and staffers from the executive branch working together and going out and doing the investigations together. We traveled on the plane together, and my reaction to all of that has been very positive. I guess we've all been brought up in the spirit of our government, of the sense of the separation of powers, and that's an important part of our Constitution, and it's to be dealt with very carefully. But I would just say that I think the Russian-U.S. POW Commission, which the Congress and the executive branch have worked together, has worked very well.
It's easy, I guess, to be quarterback on Monday morning, but I agree. You preempted my next question. I think it has worked well, and I realize there's a lot of water over the dam. We can't correct the past, but I think it has worked well. There is a real cooperative effort there that has been lacking in the past in terms of the relationship between Congress. But you're the chairman, so maybe we'll hear a recommendation on this matter from you, Mr. Quinn. Is that a fair?
Well,
go ahead. You got a difference of opinion here, guys.
Well, I was, excuse me, I was there when representatives did attend the IAG, and they were primarily, as I recall, when we would have an IAG meeting where we were going to have significant briefings from DIA, an update from a trip, or to brief them we're on the way to a trip and here's what we're doing, and that sort of thing. They could have called and attended, but it wasn't so much when you sit down and have a veto pen on a talking point from a member of Congress on a paper that's going to go somewhere. It was, hey, you're a part of the group. We wanted you to know what's going on. Eventually, they quit coming. It wasn't that we said you're out. They quit showing up.
Well, yeah, I'll let that lie. I know that happened. However, when I requested, and I don't know, when I requested attendance, I was denied under the executive privilege argument. But that's okay. I mean, I hear what you're saying, and it seems to me there might be a willingness to deal with that in the future, and I think that's positive. Ms. Griffiths, you've been involved with the issue on the IAG for quite some time. Can you give me a comparison of past, present, future, what you think in the future, but as far as how the IAG has worked in terms of effectiveness? How was it originally? How was it a few years ago? How is it now? What do you expect in the future?
I think you have to, a comparison like that is...
In terms of effectiveness.
Yeah. There were, the initial stages of the IAG was more sessions to patronize the National League of Families and Ann Griffiths. It was set up really less than serious, but before there was really any serious political priority. And this was, when it was first formed, there was probably good intention there, but it was really mostly non-functional because there was nothing much to work with. And then when President Reagan came in and he made it a priority, and the IAG started trying to develop things, initiatives, assets, and resources, it took on much greater importance and began to be an effective policy development and monitoring implementation group. And very complex when you're talking about overcoming some previously kind of sacrosanct, inviolate, separate bureaucracies who just, in this issue, just didn't have the kind of interagency coordination or focus that was necessary. So it was quite difficult in earlier years, and it evolved and got more effective, and the priority began to be understood in far reaches of the government, but it wasn't really an easy process. Especially when you're building from zero. And there was, however, extremely close coordination between state defense, Armitage, Wolfowitz, Childress, Gaston Seeger, many, Dave Lambertson later on, who just preceded Ken Quinn. So there was a group of people, all of whom subsequently became ambassadors and went to the various countries, but that worked together for a large number of years. Bob Kimmett was also involved earlier and later. So you learned where people were coming from on issues. I think Mr. Ford mentioned that. And so there was informal, constant communication of a very serious nature, but not as frequent meetings as we're having or had been having until about 5 weeks ago. So it evolved from that to where and there were ups and downs and all sorts of problems, but then it got increasingly complex as the political situation changed in Indochina. And there's always some difficulty when you have a transition in any administration, including from Reagan-Bush to Bush-Quayle administrations. There was a continuity of policy, but there are obviously changes in personnel. That always causes some rupture, some dislocation. I would say it's been more difficult and in cases more frustrating in the last 2 or 3 years, complicated in some ways by the Cambodia settlement process. Newer people who didn't know as much of the historical context as what we'd had before. Not true in all cases. But I think certainly in the last couple of years, there have been many more instances of inability to reach consensus and requirements for bumping up to extremely high levels in the U.S. government to get decisions to move forward.
So you recommend that the IAG continue in the future as an entity?
I think I addressed that in my kind of haphazard remarks there about I think it's important for the POWMI issue to stay an integrated part of the U.S. policy concerning the 3 Indochinese countries, particularly Vietnam, until such time as key elements are met in that basic policy document referred to as the roadmap. Once that's accomplished, then I can see this moving into the IG more advisory, less frequent, and the issue really being more operational into military channels in the JTF context.
Let me, since you mentioned the roadmap, let me follow up with a question on that, and then I'll yield, Senator. You very clearly stated your opposition in your opening remarks to any steps or additional steps by the U.S. to respond right now in the roadmap context to the recent events that have occurred as far as the Vietnamese providing information. Can you clarify that somewhat? Why are you opposed to any further steps or responsive steps on the part of the U.S. government now in view of the fact that information has been provided?
Well, it's not as simple as just information being provided. The U.S. steps that were designed as reciprocal steps to respond to actions taken by Vietnam were focused around specific criteria on both Cambodia and POWMIA. Certainly, Vietnam had been determined to be, by those who focused more directly on that issue, cooperative in achieving and implementing the Cambodia settlement. So it became, at that point, there were several steps taken by the United States, including all of the, quote, reciprocal steps in Phase 1 and several steps into Phase 2 that were taken by the United States when, in fact, Vietnam had not seriously worked to or acted on the 2 key areas of rapidly beginning to resolve last known alive cases and rapidly beginning to repatriate remains available to them or easily recoverable. Those 2 are key and are complementary. Vietnam did do some of the other steps. So in my view, the U.S. was certainly bending over backward, really, to provide incentives and to show its goodwill and to show its intention and willingness to move forward by providing those good faith incentives gestures. What we reached right now was additional promises, and it's being welcomed, and it certainly is welcome. But if one looks at the many years, and we have a document we put out in the League office of agreements reached and broken since 1982 between the United States and Vietnam, Now, if you look at that document, which I have supplied to the committee, there are many times that the United States has been promised archival access, access to documents, rapid repatriation of remains. What we just got on when General Vesey and Secretary Clinton and I and others were on this recent trip, Senator McCain made a major contribution to that trip, were more commitments to expand the access to documents and records, but also, importantly, the commitment to use that expanded the documents and records to rapidly recover and repatriate remains. Once we do that, I think that the United States should move forward just as rapidly as Vietnam acts in the context of the roadmap.
Let me just follow up, and then on Mr. Quinn on that point. You stated that you advocate some response, but I think Ann is correct. You know, that the roadmap is very clear in phase one that rapid repatriation of remains and resolving last known alive cases are the criteria. Are you satisfied?
I don't believe that in my testimony I advocated.
I thought you said do you advocate?
The response now, decision on that have to be made like all the other decisions on every response we've taken to Vietnam. It's made by the President in consultation with the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, and the National Security Advisor.
Well, what are you going to advise the President? I mean, what do you do you
I
advise
think
him to?
You know, the advice that we provide to the Secretary of State, I think is a matter that's within our deliberative process, and I wouldn't be comfortable, since that's a decision that's going on now, to indicate what we would or wouldn't.
I understand the deliberative process, but you don't want to offer an opinion now as to what your advice is in terms of whether or not we ought to respond to Vietnam.
Yes.
Well, let me ask you this.
I'd be uncomfortable in doing. I think that response should come from the Secretary of State to you or from the President.
Let me ask the question this way. Has Vietnam met phase one of the roadmap in regards to last known alive discrepancies and rapid repatriation of remains?
We have taken all the responses in phase one. It was a decision taken by the Secretary of State or announced by him after he spoke with the President, and to us that the judgment was that we were taking that because we were satisfied that it was appropriate and to take those steps at that time in accord with the roadmap.
Well, I'm not hearing an answer that I can understand here. Anybody else, Carl or Mr. Sheets, either one, or Mr. Childress, any of you?
Well, the answer is that we believed and judged that it was appropriate to take all of the steps in phase one of the roadmap based on what Vietnam had done.
So then if we're going to move to phase two, if we're going to move to phase two and we accept the assumption that phase one has been met, then if that's the case, then all remains have been repatriated that they have, and that all last known alive discrepancies have been resolved. I'm not saying that's. I'm just saying that's what the roadmap says, doesn't it?
No, it's not what it says.
No, it's
what
not
does it
what
say?
it says.
Tell me what it says.
Begin.
I have it right here. You can read it. It's not what it says.
I'm at a disadvantage not having it in front
I have
of
it
me.
right here. It says cooperating fully to resolve quickly. It says it's in the process of being resolved, and the other one is rapidly repatriating all recovered and readily recoverable. These are subject to interpretation.
Well, they're subject to interpretation, Mr. Chairman, but the point is, what I'm trying to say to you is, isn't it a fact, Mr. Sheets responded, isn't it a fact that we have intelligence regarding remains, that you believe that there are more remains than have been repatriated, number one. And number two, isn't it also a fact that all last known alive discrepancy cases have not been resolved? I mean, aren't those two straight facts?
First is on remains is an intelligence judgment, and I believe that judgment is true. Second, with regard to investigation of the 135 discrepancy cases in Vietnam, there's a schedule, a work plan that's been developed by the JTF that calls for initial field inquiry and the fullest investigation possible by mid-January on the remaining 135 cases. That does not mean, though, that those cases will be resolved, or that they are resolved when we recover remains or the person comes back. fate can be determined through investigative means, through records or statements from witnesses and the like. Things are on track, things are moving ahead with regard to those investigations, but the results are not all in yet.
I've taken more than my time. I would just ask for the record that if we have an agreed upon live siting plan, if we have it, as stipulated in Phase 1, I'd like to see it. I'd like to see somebody provide me a copy of the plan for how we agree upon live siting.
Discrepancy cases.
As stipulated in Phase 1, before we move on to Phase 2.
Discrepancy cases, sir, is what I was referring to. The last known alive cases that are priority cases in the JTF's
I'm
work.
talking about live siting.
Yeah, I understand.
Senator, before you get off this, can I clarify that the steps that were taken in Phase 1 and, well, actually the early steps in Phase 2 that were U.S. steps that were taken were something that I supported as well. I want to clarify for the record that there was ongoing progress and commitments and a changed atmosphere that I felt deserved some response from the United States as well as everybody else. So it was a consensus thing. What I'm saying is you can only do so much on atmosphere, and it comes to the point where you've pushed that envelope, then it's time for the actions to meet it. So I want to go on record as I was in support of that, particularly after the Solomon delegation in March of '92.
May I just, to answer the question you asked, Senator Smith, the live siting investigation plan was raised, and General Vesey obtained agreement to it, and then Secretary Solomon, when he was there in March of '92, had that formally ratified, and the details of implementation have then been worked out between our office in Hanoi in the Vietnamese Authority, which have allowed us to carry out these nearly 50 investigations.
Senator Grassley?
Yeah. Unanimously, I think this committee voted, as well as feeling that declassification of documents connected to the POW MIA matter is one of our most important achievements, and we've heard many DOD officials say likewise here today, and I personally believe it's the most important task of this committee. The United States Senate voted unanimously along that line to declassify, and even the President of the United States has issued an order to declassify. Ms. Griffith, you've consistently opposed declassification. You even moved to block access to classified data on when several members of this panel tried to get access before the committee was established. And I know that a year ago now, some members of this committee took issue with you on that matter. Your August 3rd 90 memo to Paul Wolfowitz, which I raised with you at the hearings last November, explained your fierce opposition to our access to information which you yourself as a citizen has routinely access to. Under questioning last November by members of the panel, you admitted that you never should have sent the memo to Paul Wolfowitz, and you admitted it was a mistake. Then last July, when the committee voted unanimously to declassify, and when the full Senate voted unanimously to declassify, you put out a press release saying POW MIA families reject Senate action. Is it really the families that reject this action? Did you take the position as a government official with the IAG, or did you do it as a private citizen on behalf of the families?
Senator Grassley, I thought this had probably been hashed out to your satisfaction the last time.
No, it has not.
But once again...
it's been what's happened since then that hasn't satisfied
Senator,
me.
the policies of the National League of Families, as I explained before, are established by an elected board of directors on which I do not serve. I serve at their pleasure.
Well,
the position reflected there is a position of the National League of Families. There is a board of directors elected.
Are you trying to have it both ways? You say that you can put out a press release here and yet personally feel that they should not be declassified?
No, sir, that's not what I'm saying at all. I don't even know which one you're looking at. But what I'm saying is that there is a policy of the National League of Families. There's a policy on declassification that was adopted by the full membership that I'd certainly be glad to provide, in fact, have provided to the committee, in fact, on numerous occasions. I believe at the last hearing I said that my choice of language might have been better in the memo to Mr. Wolfowitz.
Well, why are you so opposed to our declassification of this information or access to this information?
Mr. Grassley, I am not opposed to declassification of information that has been resolved or information that is no longer the subject of priority effort by this government. The families voted against declassification of information under ongoing investigation or information that would jeopardize returning our loved ones alive or dead. That position still holds, and that's the position I continue to reflect. It worries me a great deal when information, and it worries all the families, obviously, since they voted this way, that sensitive information that could be useful to accounting for our relatives is dumped out publicly. That is not to say that senators should not receive it. They should receive it and do receive it. To the best of my knowledge, you've been getting everything you've been asking for.
Well, you did say that you to this committee that I should, quote, I should never have sent that, meaning the memo to Paul Wolfowitz. You said you realized that at the time.
Senator, I didn't bring anything like that, but Mary has just handed me, Mary Backley, our Director of Operations, our specific policy. It's in our November 9th, 1992. We once again restated the League's policies. There's no misunderstanding. The official position of the League on declassification is the League supports full disclosure to the primary next of kin of all information which pertains or may pertain to their missing relatives. The League strongly opposes public release of reports or information which compromise the privacy of POW families or jeopardize serious efforts by the U.S. government to resolve the live prisoner question. That is an official policy adopted by the League.
Was there a vote on your board against declassification?
There have been many votes on our board about classification, but more importantly, there have also been votes of our entire membership, which as of today is roughly 3,850.
Well, it seems to me from the access I've had to people concerned about this issue that your position is way out of touch with that of the American people, and I think the families as well, and at least the families that have contacted, I've been contacted by. On another matter, Ms. Griffith,
Senator Grassley, could I address this too? Not
yes,
from the League
can.
standpoint, but
Yeah, go ahead.
part of the problem on the whole declassification business, it comes from privacy issues of the family is one thing. It's also the history of access that happened on the House side, which we hashed out this morning, where information was in fact coming over here and being used. What we did in the Reagan administration and what we tried to do, and I think what the family supported, is that access to the Congress to this information should come through the established committee system to try to get a hold of the problem. And we had real problems for 3 or 4 years. I have had many families come to me and say, why are they declassifying? Because they don't want it out until the issue's solved. Now, that doesn't mean everything, but there is nervousness out there in the families, and I've heard it too, and I heard it in the mid-'80s.
I have to clarify one other thing, because this continually arises that I or the League are not representing the families. We have a democratic and a certified balloting process, and we have a certified balloting process on resolutions of policy, also on the election of our board of directors, and that is certified by a publicly certified public accounting firm, just as we are audited by regularly by auditors, and it does represent the majority of the League's membership.
The press release speaks against declassification of documents. I can accept the view that a lot of documents have something to do with privacy, Mr. Childress, but there's a lot of documents that don't have anything to do with privacy, and it seems to be very indiscriminate, the position that's been taken. Now, on another matter, Our committee investigators have come up with some documents that were a couple of memos from you, Ms. Griffith, to Richard Childreth. One is dated November of '83, the other one January of '84. These memos appear to be memos that deal with meetings or correspondence that you've had with some who have had viewpoints different from that of yourself or that of the White House. For instance, one of these is a transcript of proceedings of the National League of Family Board meetings on November the 19th, '83. Present are you, Mr. Hopper, and Billy Hendon, among others. The discussion is about live prisoners and a possible cover-up. On top of your memo here is, and this is a memo to Richard Childreth, it's your memo from Richard Childreth. It has the words "protect" written on both the top and the bottom here. It is apparently being back-channeled to 4 members of the Department of Defense, officials there, and a State Department official. The cover note reads as follows: the attached notes from an executive session of the board of the NLF are not supposed to have been taken, much less distributed to government officials. Anne has taken this risk for the best interest of the issue, but they should be treated as very sensitive, for she would be in obvious jeopardy should it be known. Is your board aware that you did this? Yeah.
That's my memo, Senator.
Yeah.
The reason that memo was written is because Congressman Hendon violated national security by going into the board and talking classified information, live sighting reports. The entire board ended up tearing up their notes not to have classified information there. That is why she was sending it over to let us know that that violation had taken place and what was going on. Well, we had a member of Congress, or former member of Congress, I think at the time, doing that.
Yeah, you aren't contradicting anything I've said. I want to know if from Ms. Griffith, if her board was aware that you did this.
My chairman of the board was, some members of the board at least, I am not sure, I can't recall. What I do recall is that was the meeting that Billy Hendon, former Congressman Hendon, came to the League Board meeting at Andrews Air Force Base, I believe, and made the initial charges of conspiracy and cover-up on the part of the U.S. government and provided classified live sighting reports. And at that same meeting was where another former Congressman, John LeBoutelier, refuted everything and told specifically how Mr. Hendon was violating his security classification. And the board voted at that point to refer the entire allegation of conspiracy and cover-up with great concern about exposure of classified information, not only to shred their notes, but to refer it to the House Task Force on POW-MIA.
Why the concern about your being in trouble if you did this because your organization approved of it? I don't understand why you'd have to be concerned about that.
Those are my words. I assumed that because she was trying to protect classified information, she sent this over. I assumed the risk.
How often did you do this?
Do what,
Send
Senator?
memos like this of information?
I have never been through anything like this in my life, or since.
I'm asking her how often she had sent memos like this out. I have at least one other back-channeled memo that you sent to Mr. Childress.
Senator,
those are the only 2 that I have.
Well, I have no way of even recalling the number of times I have sent communications to the NSC, Department of Defense, State, DIA. I have no way of even beginning to know.
Okay, well,
They would probably be in their record.
Were you doing this in your capacity as a government official on the IAG, or were you doing it as a private?
Excuse me, Senator, I have no capacity as a government official. I have never been paid by the U.S. government. I do not work for the U.S. government. You keep saying as a government official with Mr. Kolesnik, I believe, whispering these things.
Well,
I am not a government official,
let's
Senator.
put it this way. Were you doing this in your capacity as a member of the IAG or as a private citizen on behalf of the families?
Both, Senator. I am the family's representative on the IAJ, and my task is to represent the views of the families to the IAJ and in the best interest of this issue. That is why the families voted, all the families at an annual meeting, that I should retain classified access and the position on the IAJ.
Yeah. Now, what was your purpose for back-channeling these memos, Mr. Childreth?
Which memos now? Another one?
I'm asking Mr. Childreth.
I back-channeled a memo? You talking about this next one?
No, I'm talking about, well...
Are we on to the second one?
Well, before we go to it, I want to read a memo that you put here. It says, this is a handwritten note from you under a notepad, National Security Council. It says, back channel and protect. The worms are coming out from under the rocks. As long as we recognize them, we will win. We will continue to monitor with friends. Signed, Dick. I assume the friends are who? Ann Mills Griffith, others?
I have no idea. This is not dated. I don't even know if it was attached to whatever's under here at the time. It sounds like...
Well, it was attached when our investigators found it.
Well, I'm not doubting that it might have been attached to something. I'm just saying, when we went through this in the deposition, I don't even remember this memo underneath it.
Well, I'd like to know.
On the speech. But anyway, let's go through it. Worms was our term of endearment to the conspiracy and cover-up crowd. So whatever this was attached to whatever this was about was that someone was obviously making ridiculous allegations of conspiracy or attacking everything we were trying to stand for or whatever. And I don't apologize for writing the cover note. I don't know that it was attached to this next one, which doesn't seem to relate to it.
I've read the memos, and I don't see anything conspiratorial
That's
about
exactly
the memos.
right. I'd like to know what I really attached to it, and then we could probably explain it. What's in this attached does not match the tone of my note. Whatever I was sending around to all concerned was obviously dealing with that period where we were all being accused of high crimes and misdemeanors.
I can address one part of it, Senator. I don't know about this note. It doesn't look logical that it's attached, since there was nothing sensitive about the other part. And the Jerry would probably have been Jerry Venanzi, I assume. I don't know. Colonel Venanzi. But this was the Red River Valley Fighter Pilots Association, undoubtedly a speaking engagement at which Colonel Venanzi might have been attending, being a member of that organization. And then there's a memorandum to national veterans organizations with publicly released status update. I don't understand the sensitivity or the question.
Tell me, I want to know why you sent it to the White House. That's the important thing.
This doesn't indicate I did, sir. This indicates I sent it to Jerry, probably Colonel Jerry Venanzi. I can't vouch for that. I'm not sure.
Well,
I just gave you what I think from looking at it. This seems to make no sense with
the other memo you sent to the White House. Why did you send that to the White House?
Which, sir?
The first one that I gave you, the one that says protect on it.
Mr. Childress was present for this meeting along with former Congressman Hendon and LeBoutelier. During former Congressman Hendon's presentations, former Congressman Hendon's presentations, he was releasing classified information in the meeting, which was subsequently, which I took notes on during that meeting, and he saw me taking the notes. I typed up the notes knowing he'd violated classified information. Subsequently, his allegations were refuted by former Congressman LeBoutelier. Mr. Childress was present for the meeting. I provided it because there were violations of classified information and as for informational purposes in the best interest of the issue. The board had shredded their notes and asked me to keep notes.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I don't have any more questions, but I do think that this has a certain amount of significance to show a mindset and a certain attitude that I think existed at this time and maybe still exists. And I think it's basic to the frustration that a lot of families feel when dealing with their government on this issue. And I just want the public to be made aware of this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Grassley. Let me come back to a couple of other questions, if I may. We're getting late, and a number of other areas. I had actually not really wanted to go into this very much today, but I must say maybe it underscores why there's tension around the IAG or part of its constitution. But while we came here today to talk almost exclusively about sort of the role of the IAG,
at this time and maybe still exists, and I think it's basic to the frustration that a lot of families feel when dealing with their government on this issue. And I just want the public to be made aware of this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Grassley. Let me come back to a couple of other questions, if I may. We're getting late, and a number of other areas. I had actually not really wanted to go into this very much today, but I must say maybe it underscores why there's tension around the IAG or part of its constitution. But while we came here today to talk almost exclusively about sort of the role of the IAG, Ms. Griffith, you've led off with sort of a series of comments about our trip and about the findings, et cetera. And I really would like to reserve most of the discussion for that till Friday. So if you want to return on Friday, we could go through that a little bit when we have people here who are dealing with that part of it. But I might just say to you that Phase 2, I read from Phase 2, Phase 2 says continue resolving with highest priority discrepancy cases of Americans last known alive. So clearly Phase 2 contemplates that you don't finish the job in Phase 1, you're continuing to do it in Phase 2. And they are continuing to do it. Everybody so testifies. It also says continue the rapid repatriation of American remains readily available. Now, some people assert that some are available, others don't, but nobody has the ultimate proof on that. And they are continuing to be repatriated, as Mr. Quinn has said. Some people tell me that if you make a huge issue out of these remains and they keep denying that they have them and we keep asserting they do, that you may make it impossible to get them back because their national honor will feel so challenged they'll say, let's go put them in the bottom of the river or the sea, and they'll never get them back. And you can run a lot of different theories, as you know, down the road as to who can behave how in this process, depending on what we do. We have continually emphasized that they have the key, they have the answers, and they do have the answers. But there's a point where if we don't show good faith in the process, they can clam up and we don't get the answers, and no family is well served by that. Now, when you say to me, we have promises that they will give us this or that, have you ever been in the Citadel before?
Not below ground.
Has any American been in the Citadel? You've been in the Citadel, into the touring the whole thing, walking around it?
I just went to a meeting with the Minister of Defense.
Anybody else been in the Citadel? How many live sighting reports did we have in the Citadel? Maybe 7 or so, correct? A number of them at Leenam Day Street?
I've been there in 1982, that prison, in 1982.
But I'm talking about the house of the general within the Citadel. This is a live sighting report, correct? Important part of the resolution process. Maybe prove somebody was alive. They let us into the Citadel. That's not a promise. That's something we did. Okay? They gave us access to a colonel who told us personally and showed us his diary. That's an archive. Archival evidence. It wasn't a promise. They gave it to us. It's not a promise. They gave it to us. 4 cases resolved, at least in my mind, maybe not in yours, but I suspect DIA will agree. 4 cases we got a good answer to. We don't have the remains yet, but we've got documentary evidence of what happened and a personal history, and we can find some other people, I'm confident. So, I mean, that's not a promise. That's a process that's happening. We got into prisons we've never been into before. the site of live sighting reports. That's not a promise. We got in. So, I mean, all I can say is, you know, if we're not willing to acknowledge positive things that happen, we're in trouble in this process.
Senator. I agree totally, which is why I've been supportive of taking the steps into Phase 2. But you did mention correctly that Phase 2 Vietnam steps say that they will continue to rapidly resolve last known live cases. Well, they didn't start yet in Phase 1. That's the problem.
Well,
now, as far as going
that's
visiting...
not accurate. I am told from our people over there, and they'll testify to this, we've got a significant number of the last known alive cases have been resolved.
No, sir, they have not been resolved. They have maybe, in some cases, 64, I believe, which is +2, there has been convincing evidence that death
well,
is
see,
confirmed.
here we get into this definition of what is
That doesn't
resolved.
mean a man's accounted for.
We get it, agreed, under our sort of, I understand that. We're going to talk about that on Friday.
Well, then could I ask, in the diary that you were shown where you said it resolves it in your mind, did that diary also indicate the remains could be recoverable, and have those families been notified?
It's possible that they could be recovered. They talked about reburying them in a certain location, and the colonel is willing to go down there and try to show the location. So indeed, the possibility is very real that they could be, and it's not obviously up to us to notify them. We left it all with DIA and the appropriate people. All I'm trying to suggest is that we've really got to, you know, be reasonable in trying to measure what's happening here. There are some extraordinary things that we're not even privileged to talk about publicly that occurred, and others that I think we have to take note of. But what did occur publicly is also extremely significant. We got shoot-down records given to us. DIA themselves said this is a very significant document. This will be very helpful to us. The prior document that we were given of similar nature was 90% accurate. 90% accurate, and helped resolve some cases, and you're familiar with that.
Yes.
So, you know, if there's going to be a kind of feet in the cement stubbornness here that suggests that, you know, when you have a process moving, I haven't advocated, you know, fully lifting or whatever. I think there's a lot we have to work this process down the road. But to sit here and say they're not doing this, they're not doing that, we're not going to, is to ignore the reality of a lot of the progress that is being made at this point.
Mr. Chairman, could I make a comment? I think that I agree with you that there has been enormous progress. In fact, I think that we would describe it at Defense as a major breakthrough. And I think that we have, I would not characterize our view as stuck in cement or stubborn. Others may feel that way. Others may attest to that under oath, that we are stubborn and persistent in our views. But I think that we have been very much in the forefront of trying to move forward based on the evidence that we have available to us, make our best judgment, whatever that might be. In fact, technically at Defense, we do not accept that the Vietnamese have fulfilled all the requirements of Phase 1. We have agreed and supported the position that we could begin to give Phase 2 quids because there had been progress. We hope to encourage other progress. But we are not prepared to accept that they have fulfilled all the requirements on remains repatriation. Now, what you put me in a dilemma, because if I thought that I had put the bar too high and that my investigations, my experts told me that, Carl, we were wrong. We think that they don't have any remains, or they have far fewer than we think they did at one time, or that the remains out in Hawaii belong to the ones that we think are missing. I would be the first to go to my superiors and come to you and say, listen, I think we had the bar too high and that we ought to lower it. The fact is that every piece of evidence that we have gotten in the breakthrough suggests that they do have far more information than they have provided thus far, that they're in fact have to explain to us if they don't have the remains, why not? The standard has never been they have to provide every remain of every case.
I understand
but
that.
They have
I'm
to provide
very
it.
aware of it, and I'm not, you know, my eyes are wide open in this process.
But you asked me to say in my response to my superiors that even though I know they have it, and that they could provide us those answers that we've asked for in phase one, you want me to say, but it's okay. Well, let's move on. I cannot do that.
That's not what I'm suggesting. I'm suggesting that there's a smart way to get the rest of the remains, if there are some.
Mr. Chairman, in all due respect,
also,
they told me this when they said there are no archives, Carl. You are wasting your time. They were eaten up by moss. And I just...
Carl, I know the history of misleading statements and of people who have said one thing and then later another happens. I understand that. And I have no illusions that you know, there may be some remains somewhere here and there or whatever, and you may be able to get some back. But I do know that if it gets raised and raised and raised to a level of screw, I mean, let me go back right here. This is your National League of Families letter in 1983 that went around to everybody, in which you criticized Bo Greitz, and you said the well-publicized endeavors of retired Lieutenant Colonel Bo Greitz are a case in point. On the most critical aspect, the live prisoner issue, there's little question that such irresponsible activities resulted in tightened security, movement of prisoners, and rendering invalid previously collected intelligence information. Official intelligence on the accounting issue, so forth. The point I'm making is that when something becomes sort of raised to a level of visibility, it can in fact have a negative impact on what you're seeking rather than a positive impact. A lot of those well-intentioned, quote, efforts to go in and rescue people and find people probably condemn people if there were any people alive. And that's what you're saying right there. It's exactly what you're saying.
It's very different, Senator.
Well, that's what you're saying.
Senator.
You said on the live prisoner issue, there's little question that such irresponsible activities resulted in tightened security, movement of prisoners. I'm surprised you didn't say they might not even kill them, because they certainly haven't been willing to negotiate for them.
Just as with remains, and then I'll defer here, but I have never known the Vietnamese to summarily dismiss something that is potentially valuable. And that has been our history throughout this issue. No one is expecting miracles. We are expecting the kind of actions that everyone knows can be provided.
Concurred. Now, they want what? They want normalization. They want money.
They want the embargo.
Credit. Yeah, all right, fine. That's what they want. That's the big want in life, isn't it? Correct? And that's the biggest priority they have. Would you agree?
Actually, what they really want is the iffy loan arrears cleared up so that they can get the International Monetary Fund.
But that's what they want. They want the money. They want the open commerce, correct? That's their priority in life. Isn't that accurate? Well, don't you think that when the United States Senate Committee was there being duped so effectively by these people, that it would have been a wonderful addition to the duping to simply hand over 40 remains and say, we've done it? Now give us the rest of it. Don't you think that would have been a terrific thing for them to do? Wouldn't that have gotten them what they really want?
You feel you were duped while you were there?
Because you and others have suggested, Ms. Griffith, that our committee has not been eyes open in this process and that we're being led down the primrose path, might say politely to you. I mean, those are your words. In other words, those are your words. I mean, that's a kind of paraphrasing of what you and others have alleged, that somehow our committee went over there and we were being misled by these people in this grand publicity stunt of theirs to let us into a prison, to give us access, to tell us things, and that we senators didn't have our eyes open. That's the gist of what you said. So I'm asking you, why didn't they just complete this process of primrose, wonderful publicity stunt, turn over some remains, and say, go home and tell Americans how wonderful we are?
Perhaps because there was so much visibility with all the press accompanying you. I can't answer for their rationale.
Not a lot of logic to it anyway, is there?
Oh, there is.
There is. So they're going to turn them up later. So turn them up later in some large group at one time.
Senator,
don't you think that the process now has condemned us to getting these back in dribs and drabs? That you're going to get 3 out of Laos, maybe you'll get 4 or 5 out of the northern part of Vietnam. They'll find a few here.
But, sir, that wouldn't be any change. I mean, that's the way,
Exactly.
unfortunately, the way that we have been trying
Because
to
the more you
slug
raise
through
it,
this for
the
many
more
years.
complicated it
No,
becomes.
well, first of all, let me, at least from my perspective at defense, I don't see your trip as having been as you described it. I think that every bit of
Well,
evidence...
I don't see it that way
Well,
either, but
wait a minute.
Ms.
Every bit
Griffith
of
and
evidence we
others
have
saw
says
fit
that
to characterize it as such.
the Vietnamese thought it was very important for you to come. They were very helpful to you and to us by providing new information. There is no quarrel that there is more information available, and that information is going to be very important to the families in giving them answers.
And it's going to come out through the archival research process, wouldn't you say?
I think that most of the answers that we seek are in that records-keeping process that the Vietnamese took,
Correct.
including the archives. Much of it in Hanoi, but as they've explained to you and to us, some of it out in the provinces. Private individuals have some of this information. The process has started. It's very positive. We want to encourage the Vietnamese that this is a very important step forward. I think that, in fact, that over the next 2 months, they have an important opportunity to move forward. Our president has said that he is prepared to move forward. Everyone in our government is in consensus that we are prepared to move forward. All we're suggesting and all we're really maybe arguing about, do the Vietnamese have remains? And if they do, should they give them to us before we move down this track, after we have said now for several years that that was an important part of the process? Now, if the archives had suggested to Carl Ford that I had been wrong, that my hypotheses, my other work suggested that I was wrong about the remains, I would feel differently. I'd say I put the bar too high. But you don't have a photograph of an American laying on the ground dead. My people show it to the families, and their first question is, where's the body? I have to have an answer. The Vietnamese can tell me, Carl, I don't have it. It was lost. Here's the contemporaneous record from my archives that shows that. Here is the other information. But you can't just be silent. I have to give the family the answer. And if
Carl,
I believe the answer is they've got it and won't give it to us, you're not going to get my vote to move forward. They're not
we have lots
cooperative
of
enough.
photographs of dead Vietnamese, and nobody can tell where they're buried.
But the
I got
history
some
of
myself, and I can't tell you where they're buried.
But, Mr. Chairman, everything that we have from these investigations suggests that the Vietnamese kept meticulous records.
I understand
including
that,
the coordinates,
but
including
you
the
don't-
practice of going back and retrieving them. Some could have been lost. Some could have been damaged in wartime. But the fact is that they have records that would show why they don't have them if they don't. They have been silent
In
on
most
that.
cases, and those are the ones that are now, I am told by our team over there, currently in the process of being resolved, are they not?
Well, one of the big problems, which we're trying to address, is that the information is coming in, but we do not yet, in my office, my hands, have an assessment of even what we've got so far.
But the point I'm making is, I mean, look, I pressed that very case and those very cases with Mr. Deek and with the entire team over there. And there is no argument among any member of this committee that if you had somebody where they have a photograph lying on the ground in those kinds of situations, they ought to have a remains. We understand that, and there are a few of those. But in the larger body of these discrepancy cases, and I've read every single one of them, they are not that kind of case. And I invite the public to read these cases because they shed an enormous light on the reality of what possibilities are here.
It's clear that our 135, which we've always stated to you, was our best information. It's clear that the number of cases that we knew about was far smaller than what the Vietnamese knew about. I think that's only logical. It's not hard for us to understand. They are giving us information on KIA, BNR type cases that we had thought were body not recovered. We would never probably find anything about. We are finding out about cases that were in Laos. There are all kinds of new information coming in that suggests that the records were quite extensive and that the Vietnamese have been very helpful in these weeks in helping us understand what they have.
Maybe there are just differences of nuance here, because I think we're both heading in the same direction, and I think we're going to get there personally. It's just my opinion that we have options available to us short of lifting the embargo, short of and I mean this, short of giving the full measure of economic benefit that they desperately want, but sufficiently capable of lowering the heat, if you will, so that there's a building of the good faith process and an opening, an enlarging, if you will, of this opportunity for the repatriation of those most difficult cases without sort of the hot spotlight. That's just my feeling.
But you've sort of had a mini IAG here this afternoon. I mean, this same question about how much is enough and whether or not we ought to, the one issue has been, well, if we give them this, it will make it easier later on. That's an issue that we've discussed and cussed for 4 years.
Well,
some of us feel one way, others feel another.
I mean, you folks ought to be jumping up and down and saying we feel good, because in effect,
now, Ken would probably disagree with me, but I would argue that the reason that we have been is because we have won most of the battles of being fair and firm with the Vietnamese, and when they produce results, we have delivered. State has delivered, defense has delivered, NSC has delivered. We have no history that if we give something to the Vietnamese for nothing, that we get reciprocal benefit from it.
Has anyone at all suggested that the next step is a gift for nothing? I don't think I've heard that.
My recommendation to my superiors is that we've gone as far as we can until we have more information on the remains. You don't know, you see, I don't put a number on it. I think that my problem is that I think in many cases the Vietnamese probably can't provide the remains. They're in private hands. They were lost in combat.
I look forward to hearing from the folks. I don't know what they're going to say, but from the experience I had over there, I got to tell you, I'm not convinced. I think there's some, but I don't think they're of the numbers that we've met and talked about with some of the DIA people in the last days.
Mr. Chairman, I'll tell you what I told General Vesey 3 years ago. Then the Vietnamese have got a real problem, because they either have them or they have some explanation for what happened to them, and that will be good enough. I mean, we have never been so stubborn or such a high bar.
I'm sure you're going to get an
explanation. We said every remain had to be returned, but we don't get it. They don't say, Carl, listen, we lost it, and here's the record to show it. They say we lost it with no backup to it. Part of my problem is that I heard the same argument when they said, we've got to quit pushing on these archives and remains because they just don't have them. I happen to buy off on the argument that they were eaten up by worms.
But you're also
and
making
moss.
an assumption on the perfection of whatever the transfer system was. Look, I think they had good records. I think they had a pretty organized system. I think they had a lot of documentation of a lot of things that happened. But I'm also convinced they don't have, I don't know what the percentage is. It ain't 100%. We all know that. And if you applied the standard we're currently struggling to them, I mean...
but why can't they explain that to us in our researches and sit down with us and explain why they don't have them?
I thought we got a lot of that kind of explanation. It's on tape. You can review it with us, and let's talk to our people as they come in. But I thought we got a lot of that explanation in fairly graphic terms in some cases, some unsatisfactory, and we continued to press on those. And I'm convinced there are some that they can account for. No question. Yes, Senator McCain.
I know the hour is late. Mr. Sheets, how do you view the relationship that should exist or has existed between your organization and this committee in the course of these hearings?
I think from our perspective, I would admit to some skepticism at the beginning about how we would find the response and the working environment. But on the whole, I would say that it's been a productive experience.
Have you viewed it as adversarial? That as one member of this committee said, we should be investigating you? Or do you view it as one where we should have been working cooperatively and together, particularly on issues, for example, such as the cluster theory, where there clearly was an attempt to exclude you from any comment on that particular method of analysis.
Generally speaking, I think we both would have been further ahead had there been a greater opportunity for staff interaction and sort of discussion as things went along, instead of always building up to a hearing and then sort of playing I've got a secret. And that hasn't always been the case, but there has been more of that than I would have liked.
How much of the effort that your organization is engaged in has been, how much of your assets have had to be diverted to tracking down the bogus pictures and the hoaxers?
Would you go ahead and ask your question?
At times, Senator, I would tell you that that process has literally precluded us from doing anything else, because the political pressure has been so intense, and the high interest among the people in the government, this committee, the American public, to know what is the truth on those cases. And there have been times when we've done nothing else, literally, but chase after photographs. And I think the longest running of those was the alleged Robertson Stevens Lundy photograph, which just, you know, went on and on and on until finally the source of that photograph was found in the
So it is really inhibited the work from time to time of your organization.
It's an opportunity cost argument. Essentially, what you're doing is dropping the work that would probably have more payoff to chase after things that ultimately turn out to be useless exercises.
Ms. Griffiths, could you give a little bit of the human side of that? What is the effect on the families, not only those who are directly affected, but others, when something like these pictures come out that are put on the front page of a national magazine? What's the impact there?
I think it was, having talked to the families that did identify their relatives, it obviously was particularly crucial and difficult for them. And I think in some cases still is. The other families, automatically, it hits everybody. Everyone gets their hopes up. Maybe this is it. Maybe this will turn out. In the case of some, it's more obvious than others. I think there was more encouragement, generally speaking, over the photograph that was believed to be Daniel Carr, or Donald Carr, I believe it was, than the one that you're referring to now. But it's obviously very upsetting, and I think the other thing that upsets a lot of the families is that they recognize that the assets and resources that are drained for any reason against what is the crucial mission of resolving the issue, it takes away and it draws it out longer, and that is always upsetting to them.
Do you think it's appropriate for this committee to be looking into that aspect of the POW/MIA issue?
You mean the purposeful fraudulent
Yes.
activities? Absolutely.
Do you believe that these efforts are being made for financial gain, these hoaxes, or what do you view as the motivation for these obviously bogus information that is being sent out?
Senator, I really would prefer, having been sued and just having gotten out of a 3-year lawsuit, not to speculate on anyone's motivation.
I understand.
And you might want to ask someone else outside the government.
I understand, Ms. Griffiths, and I retract the question. Does it surprise you that some people who have said that we've got to have full disclosure of all documents have failed to respond to requests from this committee for information from them?
Well, Senator, I'm not really truly aware of the degree to which they have not responded. All I know is that the League was asked to go back 20 years, and we did so and dug up all of the records. Yeah. And I would certainly hope, and I think it's incumbent upon the committee to insist that every private organization do exactly the same thing.
And I'd like to point out that the League of Families, the River Rats, and other organizations have been totally forthcoming. There have been several other organizations who have been like the person in the audience that just made an obscene gesture towards me, those kinds are the ones that have failed to be forthcoming with the information that I think is necessary if we're going to resolve, or at least find out what's going on here. Mr. Quinn, I know you feel neglected, so I'd like to ask you one question, if I might.
Sure.
How do you view the future of the IAG? Should it be under its present system? Is it effective? What do you have recommendations as to how the IAG should function in the future, exactly as it does now, or should there be changes?
Well, obviously, at the end of every administration, there's a review of the kind of mechanisms and structures that exist to coordinate policy. At the end of the Reagan administration, all of such structures were abolished, and then certain new structures were constituted. And I think the IAG was basically constituted as it had been previously. At least that's my understanding. So I think it's appropriate that there be a review. My sense is that when the IAG was first established, it was at a time when there's very little activity that was going on in our relationship with Vietnam, and on POW MIA front, had the impasse of Cambodia. This is probably reflected in the fact that it's chaired by a deputy assistant secretary, when often such policy coordinating bodies would be chaired by an assistant secretary. It was also set up at a time when operations, even the smallest step in terms of operations in POW MIA accounting, really equated policy. That was largely what there was. And it was set up in a way that included the League and the National League of Families as a way of, I think, very appropriate way of reaching out to the families and reassuring them about the process. We have shown a willingness to make adjustments in the IAG mechanism as it's gone along. When a special envoy was appointed, General Vesey was appointed, provisions had to be made so the IAG would work with him and in his process. A very significant change, and I think accomplishment, was carried out when the Joint Task Force was set up to coordinate and carry out field activities. And what Senator Smith and I were discussing earlier about the way that the U.S.-Russia POW Commission was set up, and the fact that it's structured in a different way, I think also reflects a willingness in looking at this issue to see if there are other ways in which coordination can be done or might be done. I think that there are questions that ought to be looked at as we come to the end of this administration. One of the questions will be, do we need a special envoy? Is the role that General Vesey has played, need that be continued? Or is the fact that there are now a lot of new mechanisms and new people in place sort of obviated that, and now can rely on a more standard and traditional approach within the government,
including the fact that General Vesey grows weary of his burden, and I think that's understandable.
I've never met someone with such a strong constitution.
Me either.
And it's been a great privilege to work with him.
I agree.
And I think then, as we look at the situation now, we see that there are the operations that are involved are enormously different, that there are hundreds and hundreds of people within the Defense Department who are actively engaged on a daily basis on this, would raise the question of whether there isn't a need for some type of sort of operational body to coordinate and to work on that aspect of the process. Likewise, as we've moved down the roadmap, you find that there are a great many other parts of the government who now are more interested, more engaged, and so the policy process in that regard is much more encompassing, and they are more interests. The Agency for International Development, consular affairs within the State Department, the Treasury Department, et cetera, and which raises the question of whether there doesn't need to be a mechanism that would work to coordinate that type of policy body. And also, I think there needs to be thought about and considered in any in however the new administration chooses to structure this process, I think the need for some sort of better mechanism to reach out to other organizations, be they veterans organizations, other POW, MIA, other family organizations, who have often expressed to me and raised the question about why they are so far on the outside when others are on the inside. So I've given you more questions than you asked me, but
I'd like to, if you haven't submitted those in writing, I'd like to have them submitted to the committee, because I think many of them are valuable suggestions that should be included in the report, because clearly we not only are looking back and looking at the present situation, but we need some ideas to how we can address this issue in the future, because as you and I know, it's not going to go away. Mr. Chairman,
just to add, I mean, those are our personal views, and
but I think, given your experience in IAG, they could be very helpful in us making some recommendations for how we can address the future on this issue. I would just like to say that since we probably will not encounter each other again, at least under these circumstances, I'd like to thank all of you for your efforts over many years. Everyone in this panel has been involved for many years in this issue. We have disagreed from time to time. I do think that each of you deserves great credit and great appreciation from the American people for the absolute dedicated job that you have done. And I, for one, hope that the record will reflect that the American people are very appreciative of your efforts on behalf of those who are still listed as missing in action. Thank you all.
Thank you, Senator McCain. We're in the second and last round. I still have some questions in Senator Grassley, so I think you can plan accordingly. Shouldn't be too much longer. I want to associate myself with the remarks that you made, Mr. Ford, very forcefully, I might add, regarding the fact that the Vietnamese have not, in the past, participated in providing information. Whatever is enough information was the term that was used, and I think you accented very well the frustration that we feel, and at the same time we understand any time we get information from the Vietnamese, whether it's a resolution of a live sighting report or a set of remains or whatever, or other information, we appreciate getting it. But the problem is that we have had our difficulty, and if you look back, and I've been to Vietnam 3 times, and every time that I have gone on a congressional delegation and returned, and there have been many that I have not been on that others have, there's always a great amount of fanfare about cooperation and so forth, and it never really pans out. I think that's unfortunately the case. But I think, to me, what is enough is that the North Vietnamese do what Ms. Griffiths has suggested that they do, which is a full resolution of all sets of remains that they know they have in their possession as a government, not what may be out in the field somewhere that they don't know they have, and more importantly, that they give a full accounting for the discrepancy cases which involve the loss of live Americans, at least alive at the time of incident. And until we're sure of that, I don't favor moving on and to phase 2. And we can get into this document is full of, you can interpret it 10,000 different ways. But I also know, and Carl Ford and I have had our differences, but we do agree on this point. And I want the record also to show that we have, the committee has seen documents about, and I won't get into the specific names to cause anybody any embarrassment here, but which indicated that you fought very hard to get support for the operation regarding those documents, those most recent documents, photographs, and that you had some resistance from certain areas within the government, but that you did hang tough in there, and we appreciate it. I think that you're correct. I mean, there are some differences between members on this issue of how fast we should move, but I believe that on a humanitarian basis, all information that they have or know they have, they should provide. Then we move to phase 2. And I might also say, based on the historical records and documents that I have seen, that I believe, had it not been for the League of Families representation on IAG and, frankly, strong DOD representation, there may have been a move to set up a roadmap without POWs and MIAs as being part of that roadmap. And I think that's very significant, and I want to state that for the record, because I think there were some who may have been more than happy to move right along with the resolution of the Cambodian situation, perhaps with the trilateral meetings, but they haven't materialized, and then just move on. So I'm, for one person, I'm grateful that that did not happen, and appreciate the fact that you were there to intercede. You may comment if you wish. If not, I'll just move on to another question.
Senator Smith, I would like to comment. I have the knack, unfortunately, of making everybody mad. I mean, obviously, I have some differences with the chairman, but I think to make sure that it's my own views and my are clearly on the record, I happen to believe that it's very much in U.S. interest to normalize our relationship with Vietnam. I spent 2 years in Vietnam. I have every reason to know that country and the horror of that war, but I think it's something we need to put behind us, both in a political sense and in an emotional sense, and I think economic and whatever. I think it makes a lot of sense to move forward. I also believe that there has been great progress made in terms of the Vietnamese following along with the roadmap and being helpful to us and moving forward. My only concern is that I think that the reason we've gotten that progress is because we've been firm and fair with the Vietnamese, and they understand if we stalk straight with them, that they will find a way to make the hard decisions and difficult choices that they have to make. And they've come a long way. And I personally am very grateful to those within the Vietnamese military and other bureaucracies that have helped us in this process of accounting for our families. I take a very narrow view. Before I can recommend to the Secretary of Defense on behalf of the families and other interests that DOD has, I just can't, in all honesty, move forward when I know that there's more there that they could give. But I hope they do, and I hope they do it in the next few weeks. And my great frustration is that I think they're missing the golden opportunity, and that they won't have for another year or so a better opportunity than at the end of this administration. Now, I know we disagree, because I think, and why I say make everybody mad, the chairman just returned. I started off, Mr. Chairman, by saying I was going to make everybody mad, because I do really differ, I think, from Senator Smith and his views on normalization and on how far the Vietnamese have come. But I also disagree with the chairman on whether or not we have enough information to move forward. I also want to say, make a comment about...
Can I just ask you something there?
Yes, sir.
You will concur with me, I would think, that these are sort of are judgments. I mean, they're kind of personal judgments that people can differ on based on interpretation and sort of analysis.
That's certainly true, Mr. Chairman.
And it is an intelligence analysis that suggests certain things, correct?
That's correct, sir.
It is not.
And I could be flat wrong, and I'd be the first one to admit that.
Well, that's a fair statement, and I think that's one of the critical components of this.
But the other thing, I've heard this several times, and
Why are you smiling so firmly there, Mr. Childress?
Well, I'd just like to point that I've seen, and I think your hearings have brought it out, that opinions for the last 20-some years on this issue have driven administrations to say there's no issue, other administrations raise it a high priority, and the rest. And some of us making, quote, opinions may not be here for the next guy to inherit the whirlwind. My point earlier today was that the closest we have to a baseline of Vietnamese knowledgeability is what DI is producing. It is more factual than my judgment or your judgment or somebody else's judgment. That's why I'm saying it's the reference point, I believe. It can change as we move forward. It can change.
See, the tragedy about that is that there are varying opinions within DIA. And
I can hire a guy tomorrow and have a different opinion.
Well, that's my point. I mean, there are different opinions
from
among
the beginning.
people. I've just come back from talking to 25 or 30 people in Vietnam who have a different opinion.
Yeah, I followed.
Some of them will testify here.
They're not experts on the question. I followed this study from the very beginning on, and also the forensics evidence that came to play as well. I think we're on the right track with Vietnam when they announced they're going to do things unilaterally, and I think they should move quickly.
But you know, the silliness of this argument is that really we are sort of hovering around a kind of minimalist differential, because nobody's talking about giving away a house here. The discussion is really what step best serves the interest of getting the full accountability. And there's a difference of opinion as to whether you're going to get more accountability by taking step A or taking step B, but neither step A nor step B give away the leverage of this country with respect to this issue. And I think that's something we ought to stay focused on and keep in mind.
Mr. Chairman, can I reclaim my time here?
I didn't know it was, I'm sorry, I didn't realize I was invading it.
And I know that I've already spent too much time, but if you'd indulge me, Senator Smith, if I could make one more comment, because you complimented me about, in an indirect way, and I've heard this very often recently, and I think Senator Grassley also paid me at least an indirect compliment. And I find that my friends have given me far too much credit and my enemies too little. I frankly, in looking at that period, I think that one, I give the most credit to the Vietnamese. I think they sought us out. I think that they had decided that they wanted to share information. And I think that General Vesey's initiative, when I first came on board, I remember talking to him, and he was pushing very hard for archives. And he told the Vietnamese, I'll even pay you. I will give you the money. And it was after that period of time that I think that the Vietnamese began to try to look for ways that were easier for them to deal with us on. And I think that at that point they thought it might be easier through a private individual. So I give the Vietnamese a lot of credit for searching us out. I also give credit to the people who risked their positions, their lives maybe even, to follow this up. And finally, I give a lot of credit for the Secretary of Defense, because quite frankly, there were very serious concerns expressed by very credible people, some of them my own. And what had to be decided with all those concerns were quite valid, and they had to be weighed. And in the end, the Secretary said that the information potential from this is far too important. We have to move on with it. But I think that it's always nice to hear people vindicate your position, but I think in the process they have given me far too much credit. But I appreciate it anyway.
I have just one further observation on the roadmap, and then I have two quick and specific questions, and then I'm wrapped up here. I think just, and if someone wishes to respond to it briefly so I can get the other questions, I don't mind, but my observation on the roadmap is that the fatal flaw on the roadmap is that you've let the Vietnamese off the hook regarding Laos. The Vietnamese have much responsibility for Laos. You cannot allow them to proceed on a roadmap of normalization without forcing them to comply with, to provide information which they have on Laos, at least have the leverage to get on Laos. We know that based on the conduct in the war, during the war, and most specifically the losses which even some witnesses today have testified that Americans, they believe, survived there after the war. So, you know, there are too many unanswered questions. They weren't at the table in Paris, and we've basically let them off the hook on that all the way through. And that's, in my opinion, is one fatal flaw of that roadmap that ought to be addressed before we move on. But that's a personal observation. Let me just ask one question. If anybody who was there, I know, I'm pretty sure you were there, Mr. Childress, but I'm not, and I guess Ann was, but I'm not sure if anybody else was at the time. This was an IAG meeting in -- There was some speculation in the press, and I do not have documentation to back it up, and I'm asking based on that press speculation, that there was a discussion at the IAG level of a rescue, some type of a simultaneous rescue operation in 1981 on known POW camps, and that it was at the level of the JCS being involved in it, at least with a representation at the meeting. Do any of you have any recollection of such a meeting in which that was discussed?
I didn't arrive till January of '82, so I wasn't there.
And do you know anything about it?
There was, I do not recall any, and I think I would have recalled if there was any kind of an IAG meeting, but before President Reagan came into office, there was not serious IAG.
Well, the press report, I believe, said that Admiral Tuttle was there, and that's the only name I have, in which he indicated, went so far as to indicate if such an operation were to take place, that there might be some might be left behind, that we would miss somebody. The significance of the debate, if it took place, is that here we are in 1981 talking about a simultaneous rescue operation on known POW camps, you know, and it's at the interagency group level, with the Joint Chairman, or at least a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff present. That's a pretty high level of discussion regarding if you don't have any valid information about live sightings. That's the reason why I bring it up. It's the reason why I asked the question. So if you don't recollect it, fine. I'm just asking.
It's after I, you know, I got there in January '82. The only thing I could speculate on is the operation that we all know about.
Yes.
But I don't think that would have taken place in an IAG meeting.
No, I agree. I think that was another one. Just one other question. This is directly to you, Mr. Childress, and I realize the sensitivity of sources, and I understand we have to kind of be careful about the answer here if you can provide one. So with that in mind, I would ask you, there was an alleged meeting that took place between Ambassador Hardy, an Indonesian ambassador, and Van Hien, who was a Vietnamese official, in 1977, in which allegedly Hardy, Van Hien indicated that there were American POWs and that had asked the Indonesians to intercede in their behalf to make some contact with the U.S. government. I have asked for the intelligence briefing on the source of that report. I was told that it was usually it was a reliable source, but that in this that they had established that it was a fabrication. Do you have any information on that particular case, or that particular issue?
No, nothing from the mid-'70s. I seem to recall in the early '80s, in the House side, there was a story on Indonesia from the '70s that was investigated, and I don't know whether that's the same one or not.
There have been several references to Indonesia.
It was an Indonesian, supposedly Indonesia-U.S. talking in the mid-'70s.
No, not U.S. This was Indonesia and Vietnamese with Van Hien. And
oh, I see. Okay. Well, then I think it does relate to the one that the House went through. I see what you're talking about. It wasn't a U.S. conversation.
Do you know who the source was for that?
No, I do not.
You never relayed to anyone?
Well, I wasn't here.
No, I know that, but subsequent information that you may have learned upon coming to the government, you never relayed to anyone your knowledge or any knowledge of who that source or what that source was of that report.
I had no firsthand knowledge of that report when I came to government, did I?
I know you didn't have any firsthand knowledge of the report, but I'm asking you if you ever had any information provided to you as to who or what the source was of that report.
Not that I recall. The only thing that I would if I knew the source of the report, I would have gotten it in the context of, if this is the one I'm thinking about, came up in the House task force, and if somebody was investigating and researching the report in the government, then I would have gotten it from someone in the government itself. But I don't recall knowing the source.
All right. Well, it was a CIA report, and I've tried for the past 4 or 5 months to get the source and identified, and I was told that you had indicated that you had knowledge of the source. I realize you weren't there, so I'm just asking, but that you had knowledge of the source or had been told of knowledge of that source, and that it was a very reliable source, and that you knew that it was reliable, and that.
No, I'm sorry, I can't help you on it. If it's a report I'm thinking about, it was investigated in the House, and I would have only known what was open within. But I would have never. I don't recall the source.
Yeah, well, okay.
I mean, if I did, I would remember. And
you don't recall it ever being determined to fabrication.
If we know the source, it should be available. If we knew the source then.
That's what I thought, but I haven't been able to get the source. Thank you.
Senator Grassley, do you have any further questions?
Yes. Again, I want to ask Ms. Griffith something that I think you recommended just a few days after our April 23rd, 92 meeting in our committee meeting in S407, which was a briefing on live sighting reports. Did you recommend after that that the Senate Select Committee should not receive any more live sighting reports from DIA since inexperienced investigators will misuse them?
I don't recall anything like that. I don't know what I didn't know you got the briefing. I might have known it at the time.
No.
This isn't ringing a bell at all.
My source is, do you have a current clearance for classification for secret and above?
Yes.
Take this.
I would put it the other way. But.
This will be the reference, and I want you to read what was reported and see if that wasn't what you were recommending.
You don't think so? This is interesting. All forwards leaving? Oh.
I don't recall this. This is an internal State Department memo. I've never seen it. If these
And you don't recommend, or you don't remember making that recommendation that there shouldn't be any more live sighting reports come to the Senate?
No, not coming to the Senate. I mean,
Senate,
cleared members of the committee and
well,
cleared
that clearly
committee
states that it was your view that there shouldn't be any more live sighting reports come to the Senate Select Committee.
Well, apparently somebody on the staff at State is characterizing me or what I said or what I think here. She's there for this and that. I've never seen this. And if this is...
And you're saying categorically that you didn't have that opinion and you didn't express it?
I'm saying that our position has been that live sighting reports under investigation should not be declassified. That's very different than this committee having access to them. I don't understand what your question is about investigation here. In fact, I don't understand your whole focus, Senator.
Well, but what that said, that doesn't say that anything about declassification. It simply states that the information shouldn't come to this committee.
No, it doesn't say it shouldn't come to the committee, sir.
Well,
I mean, is this declassified now so
no,
that I can
it's
read
not declassified.
Well, then I can't read it
No,
out
you
loud.
can't.
That is not what it says, Senator. I see your staff. Okay.
Well, let me say to the committee, that is what it says, and I suppose...
Do we have a copy of it possibly? What is this?
Well, yes, I got it from your staff. No. Let the chairman read it, please, and see. You know, one of two things. Either you said that or somebody's trying to frame you.
That just happened in Time Magazine, Senator.
Yeah, we're talking about a State Department official.
Thanks.
You agree with my interpretation of that, as I just expressed it?
I didn't hear what you just expressed.
Well, basically, this is a report that Ms. Griffith is saying that live sighting reports should not come to the Senate Select Committee.
Active live sighting reports.
Yeah, because they might be misused by committee investigators.
Correct. I read it that way.
Yeah.
Excuse me, Senator. That is not what it really says. What it's saying here is the same point that I have tried to make again and again. untrained anybody, including untrained family members going to Vietnam to do crash site investigations and excavations, are damaging to the issue. Untrained anyone is that.
But I think the chairman believes that the people he's hired are very well trained to make these analysis and to be very helpful to us.
Well, sir, perhaps they do have skills about which I'm unaware, but I've also seen investigation conducted even by U.S. officials by individuals that do not have the kind of investigatory and linguistic capabilities that I feel should be utilized for
I think it's a split decision here. I think that your statement is accurate in saying that untrained investigators could impede the process of live sighting report follow-up that you're still working on, active ones. On the other hand, Senator Grassley is 100% correct that as a consequence of that view, you were against turning over any active live sighting reports to the committee. So
not to the committee, sir.
that's what it says.
Not to the committee.
Well, it says to the committee.
Untrained. Well, I can't help how someone else characterized anything I said. As I've said, I have never seen the memorandum at all.
Why, as a private citizen, do you assume such a role of what information the United States Senate ought to receive or not receive?
I didn't, Senator.
Okay.
That is not what I said, and I have not assumed a role to determine what the committee should and should not have. I've repeatedly testified to that.
Let me ask Mr. Sheets a question on a whole different subject. In August, I raised with you the discrepancy on the three-man photo, and I asked for a response for the record. And in regard to that, I'd like to refresh your memory. The Defense Intelligence Agency position on the photo is that its origin is December 89th Khmer language version of a Soviet magazine. Yet, according to a former official working at Site Number 2 in Thailand, he saw the photo 1 year earlier. And the reason he knows this is that he wasn't in Thailand after January of '89. Furthermore, both the official's wife and a friend of his in North Carolina identified the photo, having seen it 1 year before December of 1989. Have you been able to resolve the discrepancy, and if so, how did you do it? What resolution did you have of it?
The individual who you reference sent in a photograph that we think, in approximately that time frame, 1989 time frame, that we think is the one that he was referring to. I recognize that they perhaps have told your committee that that it's the photo of three, but the photo that we have in our records that is sourced to this individual is a photo.
Do you think that, or do you know that?
Well, we have the photo that he provided us.
Can you produce the photo?
I absolutely can. And I have a fact sheet on that investigation that I'd be pleased to give the committee for the record.
Well, that's what I was going to ask for. You talked with to the source, and we can have a copy of that report.
I'd be pleased to give you the fact sheet we have and the photo that we have.
And that would be of the
We're speaking of Mr. Don Scott here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll be pleased to give you the results of that investigation.
Okay. Well. What? Yeah. Who are the other? Can you state who the other two people are identified?
I don't know who the other two people are that have identified that photo. I have the magazine in my office, the actual magazine that came out of the collection that the former Soviet Embassy Cultural Center turned over to the National Library of the State of Cambodia. I have the magazine in my office. I'd be pleased to show you that magazine as well.
Which photograph is this? I've seen one of the magazines, or two of them. Which photograph?
This is the source.
Is this the baker? Is this the cook? And
no,
this is the other one?
This is the photo
this is
when it was retouched and altered, alleged to be that of Robertson, Stevens,
and
Lundy.
This is the three. All right.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I'd be pleased to give that magazine. I know that copies of it and staffers from the committee have looked at the magazine. I have the actual magazine in my office. I'd be pleased to produce again for the committee's review.
That'd be great.
There's no doubt in my mind that that is the source of the photograph that ultimately became known as the Robertson-Stevens-Lundy photograph.
If you had this information, how come I haven't gotten it by now?
It's not been kept back from you. It's been provided to the committee staff.
I asked for it in August.
I think the committee's seen it. I think the committee has seen it. I'm not sure why.
That's the magazine you brought to the,
To the briefing?
Yes, yes, it is.
It may be that you
Yeah,
just
you may
missed
have
that
missed it.
particular
That
briefing.
that was provided.
Mr. Chairman, I have no more questions.
Thank you very much, Senator Grassley. Just very quickly, while you're here, there's some issues we want to go back into considerably on Friday, but since live sightings came up today, Mr. Sheets, maybe you could just very quickly, and Mr. Ford, address the question of where we stand with respect to live sightings. How many have been found to be true? How many are outstanding? Can you give the committee just a quick summary? Or I tell you what, if you want to put it together, if you don't have it with you, if you could bring that on Friday, we can just follow up with that. Is that easier?
Whatever you'd like.
Very helpful to have the sort of current, up-to-date, and since the folks will be reporting, I'm sure they'll have it with us anyway.
I'd be pleased to bring that on Friday.
Okay, that would be very helpful. Any other questions? It's been a long day, but I think it's been a very helpful day, particularly the early inquiries. There are some questions I know that are still a little bit outstanding. I don't want to belabor them now, I don't think, but I think Ms. Griffiths, maybe I could just ask you quickly, and if this is something that merits a lot of time, then we can delay it, but each of the IG reports, or 3 of them specifically, cited your specific involvement very directly in DIA affairs, et cetera. You recall those reports. I'm not going to go into them in great detail now. But can you at least, as a sort of a basis for the record for the committee, can you address the issues that were raised in them about sort of the degree to which they felt you were calling some shots and had your own channels and access and were, in some people's minds, sort of, I think, overbearingly present as a force for a non-agency person, and I just want you to address those so we have something on the record with respect to it.
Well, first of all, I never read them until this weekend because I never was interested in reading them. They were internal. People are always readjusting, reworking, and looking at how to improve their process. I was expecting and seeing the improvements that were being made. I mean, I think that the committee itself has sufficient experience with a lack of any bureaucracy, department, or agency's unwillingness to open itself up to anyone, particularly someone outside the government. And officials come and go. I have seen DIA go in and out, up and down, and every other way as far as openness, totally closed. Admiral Brooks was a totally closed. Admiral Paulson was a totally open. Admiral Tuttle was an open. I mean, they have gone all over the map about whether they're open or closed. I have found the working relationship with DIA extremely good. I have learned a healthy respect for the dedicated analysts, particularly within the last year, a little over a year. It's been very difficult to get a hold of Bob Sheets or Chuck Trowbridge, who were always over on the Hill for the most part, working on, you know, responding to the committee and testifying and other things. But I have found that that they're a very professional group over at DIA. The experience and the capabilities of those who've been there for an extraordinary amount of time and through many years are very dedicated people. But I've also seen them come from a situation where they had no backing and no priority and no attention whatsoever to massive, massive demands and 15 times their original size almost. So they've had their growing pains. I found the relationship fine. I am a little surprised that that many, after reading them this weekend, that many would feel so insecure, basically, about having someone who had a sole purpose of resolving the issue and an access to the information, having access to it.
Well, let us perhaps follow up with a few questions in writing if we need to. I appreciate your answer, and I did want to get something on the record. Let me also ask, if I may, of Mr. Sheets and Mr. Ford. I don't think Mr. Quinn, the State Department, I think we're pretty clear with at this point. But can we have your agreement, given the sensitivity, obviously, of the issue of disclosure and the amount of information, that whatever documents are critical to the committee in this final few weeks, that we will somehow reach an agreement as to how we're going to get them, if we need them, if there are documents yet to come. I think it is awfully important for the committee to be able to get those fully in our hands, or at least in a process where there is a guarantee as to what will happen in the next days.
If you're speaking to declassification of the remaining records, I'd just point out that the Central Documentation Office that does that work is not part of DIA. That office reports directly to Mr. Andrews.
No, I've talked to him directly, but I just want everybody's assurance if there are any documents, as we do a punch list, which we're going to be doing later, and making certain that we're where we want to be with respect to that we'll have your cooperation on it. And we have had it. I'm not suggesting we haven't.
Is there a problem now, Mr. Chairman? Because you certainly have our assurance that we will be, whatever documents you identify, we will
We
try
still
our
have
best
some documents that we need through the DOD/DI process. We'll get those.
I think one area that could be very helpful, and frankly, it's been a real problem, is the POW debriefs, not regarding anything in there other than the names of individuals that they saw. I've only, we're restricted to the chairman and myself. There are 590 of them, and it's impossible to get through those with the two of us doing it. I understand the sensitivity of that, but all we really want is the comparative list of those people that they saw and those who came home. And I'm finding some real problems with the few that I have looked at in terms of people being identified as having been seen who were not, who did not come home, which is contrary to the official position. Now, I have found several, and I've only looked at a dozen cases, and I think it's important that we get through those. And I understand also that you don't want every staff member rumbling around through there, but if you could give us a clearance for a couple of the senior people to do it, it would be very, very helpful. We can't, you haven't done that, and we can't, it's impossible to get it all done.
I always put my foot in my mouth. I said I would cooperate.
Well, we have permission.
That obviously is one that's above my pay grade. I mean, part of this is
we have permission from 250 already, and those should not be a problem, in my opinion. These are questions.
Is there any possibility that as a compromise, Senator Smith, that you might allow us to go through that and do this work ourselves? I mean, part of this is a contract that we have. It's not a legal contract, but it's certainly a contract in principle, not only to the past POWs, but any future POWs, that when we talk to them after they come back, we know that they've been through hell. We don't expect them to be anything other than human, but we want to know. We need to know what happened to them. And we've always made it clear in that process that these would be guarded as sort of nuclear weapon secrets or something. And that's the reason that we've done that.
Yes. Council just tells me, and I said it before, we have releases from 250 of those people. And I might just say, having gone through maybe 24 at this point, I'm not interested in some of the things in there, and they are very personal, and I don't really care. I don't need to know it, and frankly, I don't read it. I try to go over it without reading it.
And just pick out the names.
And looking for names, and that's all we want.
I understand, but I understand that you are getting the releases. My point is an institutional one, and I'll try to defend it as best I can. The fact is that for the next Vietnam or the next Desert Storm or the next World War II, there's going to be a group of people that are POWs, and I want them to know that no matter what they tell us, that 100 years later, whatever they've told us will not become public.
Well, and we all concur with that. There's no issue about that.
We're not going to make it public. I mean, we've got
issue about that.
You send people over carrying the documents who are the carriers of the documents. They sit there and read them while I'm reading them. Certainly, a senior staff with the appropriate clearances ought to be reading them. It doesn't make sense. And let me just say also that the problem, I only looked at 24, and I have found examples of individuals who were firsthand cited by returning POWs who said they saw this person alive and they did not return. Now, that is not what the position, the official position of the government is. And that's what's sending me an alarm. I've talked to Ann Griffiths about this as well, and I think it's a serious problem that we have to look at.
Well,
so
I think that
we've got to get access to those.
I'm in a difficult position because I have to admit to you that I have not looked through these.
Well,
and in fact,
But that doesn't affect, the committee has a responsibility. And if we've got a body of evidence out there where POWs came back and somebody mentioned, I saw Joe so-and-so, you know, and he doesn't come back, I mean, that's, again, you want to talk about a discrepancy case, there's a case.
Well, this is an area where I'd like to pick up on what Senator McCain said earlier. I would love to have the names of and the debrief, and I'd like to give you my assessment of the significance of that.
Well, we think you ought to have that.
Well,
but see,
it's not been provided to us, and I'd be pleased to deal with that.
Okay. I don't have any.
What's not been provided? I don't understand. What's not been provided?
Well, I would love to provide you with.
In other words, if you've come up with a name, he would like to know.
I'd like
the
to
name.
give you an analytic
provided
paper.
it. Ask your people that carried the documents over. I discussed it with them.
I'll look into that, and I'd like to give you back some feedback.
But I asked for it. I said this was the problem, and I discussed it with both of the people, one of whom is sitting here in the audience. I discussed it with both of those people. I said, look, here's the problem. This person is on the list of missing. Sure. He was identified, and I showed them on the sheet how he was identified, first-hand sighting. I discussed it and asked for a response. I didn't get a response for 10 days.
We have a communication breakdown here, Senator. You have my word.
I know. I understand.
I will look into this, and I'll get you back a report.
Okay, but tomorrow, can we hear from you as to if we have a waiver on 250 of these?
Right.
Surely, some staff people can look at those 250 that are waived in order to speed up this process, so that we don't wind up where Senator Grassley suggested we might at the end, not having done it. I don't want to be in that predicament. And really, it depends on a reasonableness here.
Well, I
sat there personally. I took a day to do this, and I sat there, and I could only get through, you know, what did I read, 8 or something? I mean, they're long, obviously, and if you're really going to skim, I wasn't reading every word. I was just skimming them.
And they're not, unfortunately, the names are not highlighted. Some cases they are, but in others they're not highlighted at all, and you have to go through them again.
I obviously will report back and highlight your concern, the importance that you attach to it, and that time is growing short for your report, et cetera, and I will faithfully do that. I have not been involved in this discussion, so I hope I didn't misspeak for my colleagues who do have control of this. But I know it's a very difficult issue for us in terms of maintaining the integrity of something that's gone on for several wars. And that even if someone now says that it's okay to look at what I said, we have to protect the rights of all the people, even the people who don't want to know. And
well, we all share that. I don't think anything in this process violates that. And in point of fact, it can ultimately result in a stronger accountability process for any future wars that we might have to fight.
But could I offer, again, I'm sticking my nose into an issue that's really not mine, but it would seem to me a reasonable compromise. I mean, obviously you feel the information is important. And we have the difficulty in widening the number of people, additional people that have access to this material. Isn't it possible that we could at least try to do what you and Senator Smith want on our own with someone that maybe didn't do it the first time, to come up with their own independent assessment of what's in there? Would give you a better way to double check us without expanding the number of people. Just think about that. But it would seem to me that there ought to be a way that instead of just simply having this issue between us, that we try to work out something where we keep some of the prerequisites we think are important, and you get
maybe
the information
good way
you want.
to do it. The balance would be, since 250 people have given us a waiver and there isn't an issue as to 250, we deal with the 250 and you deal with the other 250 or other 300 and some, and the balance, we see what we both come up with. Maybe that's the more reasonable way to come at it.
Well, but again, I'm maybe speaking out of turn, but
why don't you review it and get back to us?
I'm trying to protect the person 5 years from now or 10 years from now who doesn't want to have the precedent set that you can right away. And I mean, I think there'll be pressure on all of the former POWs. Well, why didn't you give the waiver? I don't think that's fair. I don't think it's appropriate that there be this difference between those who agree and those who don't. I think it's a very private matter. It's very important to us that they be able to tell us whatever they feel at the time.
I would also, I think it is very important immediately to determine statistically what the significance is of the names that Senator Smith has out of the 12 or so he has. That will help lead us as to what needs to be done here too. So that is a report that ought to be able to be given back to us almost immediately.
I know we want to wrap up here. Let me just say though what part of the problem is. There is a summary of each of those debriefs, and then there is an actual testimony. In some cases, the actual verbatim testimony is not available. It isn't there, whether it's been destroyed or whatever, I don't know. I forget which cases, but and what I have found where we have testimony and summary, in some of those summaries, there is no mention of who they saw at all. Nobody, even people who returned. John McCain isn't, if the guy saw McCain, he's not there. And we know John McCain came home, so he's not there. So in some cases, what I'm saying is there's nothing in the summary that would indicate they saw anybody. So in those, where I saw those, I then went and asked for the verbatim.
The transcript.
The transcript, and they provided that. And when I read the transcript, there were then names of POWs in the transcript. But I don't understand why that wouldn't be transferred over to the summary, because that's the most significant thing. Then there were also cases, just for your own information, there were also cases where you have an Air Force list of POWs who were cited. Okay, so-and-so was cited, and then you look over and you see who cited him. On that list would appear a name which would not have, and saying that so-and-so saw him, but on the summary and on the documents that I'm provided, and even in the actual testimony, in some cases, the actual verbatim transcript, that name is not mentioned. So there's something, and almost in every case of the dozen or so that I looked at very specifically, the person who is missing is always the person who's on the MIA list. It's not the person who came home. So, I mean, missing from the list. So, I mean, it's very complicated, and I tried to explain it to your people who came over with the documents, but it's just too much for the chairman and the vice chairman to do that. We can't, it's just too much. I mean, it took me almost 3 days to get through 12 of those trying to figure that out, and it just doesn't, it's too much time. You can't do it. We have to have staff help.
Carl, could you call us tomorrow, perhaps, give us a sense of where we're going on this?
Yes, sir, and I will check with Dwayne Andrews and others who have been more personally involved in this.
Obviously, if there's a way to expedite and to find a competent way to expedite, that will serve us all very well.
My sense is, and I don't want to mislead you, I think that this is one that you're dug in on, we're dug in on, and I think that as we did with Bobby Garwood's case, and we in fact put people sort of independently on it to look at it very closely and report back to the committee on it because we'd made a mistake. And if we have not done it thoroughly enough or whatever, we can obviously put people on this and do a crash thing and give you the facts rather than analysis.
I think we're going to have to discuss whether it's a complete piece of it, but it's certainly a beginning. Sure. We will stand in recess until 9:30 tomorrow morning.
Authority and funding for the Senate Select Committee on POW-MIA Affairs expires at the end of this month. The committee will then issue a report of its findings, which will include recommendations to the new Congress and the Clinton administration. This programming note that Senator Kerry and his committee are scheduled to reconvene up on Capitol Hill later this morning. They are expected to discuss private efforts to resolve the POW-MIA issue, along with fundraising and public relation campaigns to keep alive the issue of missing U.S. servicemen. And C-SPAN will be there to bring you live gavel-to-gavel coverage of Wednesday's hearing, set to begin at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time. That's 6:30 a.m. Pacific Time. Now, if you would like to comment on these hearings or the work of the Senate Select Committee on POW-MIA affairs, write to the committee in room 705, Hart Senate Office Building, here in Washington, D.C. The zip code is 205